And then usually in midsummer, their fat stores are the lowest, so they increase their current spot rather than spreading and dispersing to other spots. While in the fall, their fat stores are the highest, so they prioritize dispersing outside of the current spot and can actually travel over 1 kilometer from that spot potentially. So going into the local impact here on this map, you can see Long Island, and in the green area is the Central Pine Barrens region of Long Island, which we manage. But there are pine barrens and pitch pine stands outside of this area, especially on the South Fork out here in Montauk, as well as west of the Central Pine Barrens region. So in terms of local impact, initially it was found in New Jersey in 2002 was the first detection. And one of their worst years was in 2010 when they had 14,000 acres affected in a single season. And Long Island, with the second largest pine barrens area, had detected southern pine beetle in 2014. The initial detections were in Hampton Bays, Connecticut, Shirley, and Mastic. And from there, it has continued to spread. Currently, we're in full-on outbreak mode. It's basically everywhere, but our current hotspots are Brookhaven National Lab and its bordering properties, including Brookhaven State Park and some county land. And then another hotspot is the David Sarnoff Preserve out here near Riverhead. This year was the first year we've detected southern pine beetle in that park, and it has been continuing to spread rapidly in there, as well as Napeague State Park out near Montauk has been a major hotspot this year for state parks. And these are just some aerial images taken by my supervisor, Polly, in her drone flight. And you can see these were taken at the Ridge Conservation Area, just northwest of Brookhaven National Lab. So here you can see an established infestation of a few hundred trees. There's some dead trees, as well as some stage 2s and potentially stage 1 trees that are still green. Chris will get into identifying the stages of infestation. A lot of the rest of the green trees you can see in this area are actually oak trees. So southern pine beetle does get established in mixed stands, as well as pure pine stands. And then this photo on the right is another image of that infestation, as well as in the distance on the horizon, you can see a lot of red, which is actually Brookhaven National Lab in the distance there that is really exploding with southern pine beetle this year. So pretty impactful images. And in terms of its northern expansion, this data is from 2016 in the image on the right. They're trapping results from the US Forest Service. And all of the red dots are where southern pine beetle was detected. So it has gone as north as Massachusetts. I think since then there have been detections in New Hampshire as well. Kevin Dodds will get into that a little bit further in his trapping presentation. But typically, really the only limiting factor besides availability of pine trees is winter temperatures. As long as they are less than 16 degrees Celsius, southern pine beetle can't really get established. So, but obviously with global warming and global climate change, it's continuing to move northward as our winters get milder. So now I'm going to turn it over to Chris, who's a field tech with New York State DEC, and he's going to talk about southern pine beetle identification and signs and symptoms. So I'm just going to flip the camera around to him.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Like Sabrina said before, my name is Chris Steigerwald. I'm a forest technician with the DEC. I work mainly in our southern pine beetle program. I've been working with these beetles for about 3-4 years now. And so far, they've shown no signs of really slowing down here on Long Island. So our first slide, this is some quick southern pine beetle identification. What we're looking at is a very tiny, small bark beetle, about 1 to 3 millimeters. I like to tell people it's about half the size as an uncooked grain of rice. or a broken chocolate sprinkle, very tiny bugs. So what you're first going to look for when you're trying to find southern pine beetle out in the field is you want to look for these small pitch tubes. They're about the size of a piece of popcorn. They've ranged anywhere from about the size of your pinky fingernail to about thumb size. So they kind of got a range. It really depends how much resources that tree has to produce this resin. And you'll see these pitch tubes, they can be anywhere from 1 or 2 to 1 or 2,000 on this tree, all the way from the base to the top of the canopy, and then even out on the branches as well on very heavily infested trees. And some of these pictures you can see right here, this little black dot and this one over here, these are actually the beetles swimming in these pitch tubes. Some of them will get entrapped in them and that'll be successful in the tree to pitch them out, but most of them kind of do this backstroke and kind of move through this resin fairly easily. And another sign, you'll see some small frass, which is basically just kind of sawdust. I've noticed this year, since it's been a little droughty here on Long Island, that some of these trees aren't actually producing pitch tubes. You're just seeing frass coming out of the tree, and that's kind of a good indicator that these beetles are currently boring into it. So here on Long Island and in the Northeast, we have a lookalike species. We have a couple of them. The biggest confused one is black turpentine beetle. You can see in this picture right here in this lower right-hand corner is a southern pine beetle. It's an uncooked grain of rice right here, right next to it. And then this is a turpentine beetle. It's about twice the size. It's much larger. And their pitch tubes, if you look in this picture, are about double or triple the size of a southern pine beetle pitch tube. But what's also indicative of black turpentine beetle is these pitch tubes usually only occur about chest height and below. So in rare situations, they'll get maybe 7-8 feet high, but for the most part, I would say 6 feet and under on trees. If you see these giant pitch tubes, it's most likely turpentine beetle. And these beetles will kill pine trees as well, not to the extent as southern pine beetle. They usually take 1 to 4, maybe 5 trees in a year. But they're a native species and they don't do too much damage, and those trees really become good wildlife habitat trees. And this last point, it's not unusual to see both these beetles infecting the same tree. A lot of the time you'll actually have turpentine beetle boring into trees, and the tree is releasing stress chemicals, and that actually calls in southern pine beetle around it. So most of the time you'll have this effect where turpentine attacks the tree first, stresses it out even more, kind of rings a dinner bell for southern pine beetle, and they come in and kind of finish the job and really expand from that point. Another lookalike we have are Ips beetle. They're very similar to southern pine beetle as far as size, but the main difference, I don't know how well you guys can see this, but their back abdomen area is kind of flat or scooped in appearance, and they have these spines coming off the back, whereas southern pine beetle is just very round and it doesn't have any of these spines. This is something you could really only tell by looking under a hand lens. It's very hard just by going by eye. But if you don't have the hand lens available, if you peel back the bark and you look at this picture on the right, these are all different galleries. And so they'll actually make different patterns to southern pine beetle, where Ips, they'll be straight lines, or they'll kind of look like Ys or H's, where southern pine beetles, they're kind of just all over the place and just kind of doing these crisscross different type of patterns. This is the best way in the field to kind of really quickly determine what type of beetle you might be seeing in a tree. So southern pine beetle, we break it down into 3 stages of attack. Stage 1 is a fresh attack tree. This is where those adult female beetles just board into these trees. They release those pheromones, and all the males are following behind them, and there's a mass attack. Like I said before, it could start out as few as 1 or 2 pitch tubes to thousands of them, all the way up. And you'll get the pitch tubes. They'll range in color anywhere from a white to like a pinkish brown tan type color. And like I said before, they'll be popcorn size. They'll be all length, all the way up the tree. You'll see southern pine beetles swimming in the pitch. You'll see frass going around, and then one important part of the stage one fresh attack trees is that the canopy is still green. There'll be no sign of discoloration or fade or anything like that. It kind of looks like a healthy tree from far away or up in an aerial survey, but you really won't know until you get up close and personal and you see those pitch tubes all the way up it. Another good indicator is when you see the predators around. We have these adult clarid beetles. They like to hide on the bark and kind of ambush the southern pine beetle as they're swimming in the pitch or traveling along the tree. Sometimes I'll just see 20 to 50 adult clarid beetles running around a tree, not really seeing many pitch tubes, but that's kind of just a very good indicator that, all right, they're probably feeding on southern pine beetle that are just freshly attacking this tree in the very early stages of a stage one. And another good sign is woodpeckers. You'll just hear, the woodpeckers, in the woods just going to town on these trees, kind of like an all-you-could-eat buffet to them. They don't really mind southern pine beetle too much. They actually quite prefer it as a food source. And then we get to stage two. At this point, so the females have laid their eggs. They usually hatch in about 2 to 9 days. It depends on the weather. And at this point, you'll have those eggs will hatch into larvae, and they'll begin tunneling into the cambium and actually feeding on the main part of the tree. They're spreading around that fungus, that blue stain fungus that Sabrina touched on earlier. And you'll actually have multiple brood stages, anywhere from maybe some unhatched eggs, some larvae, different stages of larvae, early stages, late stages. You'll have some pupas, and then you'll actually have some new adults kind of emerging, getting ready to leave the tree. And what's another good sign, so when you're in the woods looking for these stage two trees, those pitch tubes will be a little hard. They're not that sticky, almost runny resin anymore. They're kind of really just almost solidified to an extent. And you'll start to see this canopy change where, they'll start to become yellow, even beginning to turn kind of an orangey color. And usually when I see a whole canopy is yellow, it's kind of a good indication that it's a good stage two tree, got multiple beetle life stages going on, and they're actually probably getting ready to leave the tree at this point. And at this point, the woodpeckers will still feed on this tree. The clarid beetles usually tend to stick to the stage one trees. They like the fresh attack ones. And once we get to stage two, we transition to this stage three vacated tree mortality stage, where this canopy turns to a dark orange, reddish, and it'll actually begin to drop all its needles. So usually once you start seeing branches that are becoming bare, these beetles are mostly have left this tree, and it doesn't become effective to really cut it anymore because they're no longer in there. So at this point, this tree is dead or close to being dead. So you'll have some other beetles come in, like this one picture in the middle. This is ambrosia beetle dust. It's actually a very white, fine dust that usually accumulates, on the ground at the base of the tree. That's kind of a good indicator. Okay, the southern pine beetle has left this tree. It becomes a good wildlife tree now. So let's try to move on and find these stage ones and twos where they become effective as far as cutting and suppression goes. So I took these pictures. This is from one of our aerial surveys. You can see I kind of broke it down where in this red, you got these nice brand new habitat trees that, birds and other animals that live in trees will love. And then you get these stage two over here, and this is orange. This is these orange yellow stages. And then the stage ones, you can't really tell from the air, but all these green trees kind of around it are most likely currently infested, early infestation stage of southern pine beetle. They tend to move in this finger-like pattern, but eventually you'll get another finger coming off in another direction, and then they'll fill in between the fingers. So you'll kind of get, these fingers going through, and then they fill in, and then more fingers go out, and then they fill in again. And that's kind of where you get this really rampant expansion of these beetles. So this is what you would see from the air, if you're doing a drone survey or flying in a helicopter or a plane. I have another picture on the ground. This is a nice panoramic picture where if we work left to right here, on the left, you got your brand new, gorgeous looking habitat trees, that the wildlife will tend to love. You move to the right, you got these stage 3, you got this orange, almost dark orange, getting to that red stage where they'll start dropping these needles. Keep going to the right, you got these stage 2, these ones right here, they're just starting to turn yellow. So this is that kind of transition phase between stage 1 and stage 2. And then if you keep going right, these nice green looking trees over here are probably all currently infested with stage 1 trees. When you're dealing with southern pine beetle, the stage 1 and stage 2 are the trees you're really looking for because they're the most effective for suppression purposes. So that's all I have for signs and symptoms. At this point, we'll open it up for questions. I don't know if you guys want to put them in the chat or raise your hands, and we'll answer your questions as they come in. I just want to thank you guys again for calling in this morning and showing interest in southern pine beetle, stuff that Sabrina and I work with pretty much on a daily basis. And this is our contact information. If you guys ever have any questions or anything like that, you can shoot either one of us an email or give us a call at any time, and we'll answer it the best we can. If not, we'll point you in the right direction. Looking for your answers. I'll pass this back over to Sabrina.
All righty, Sam, what do we got in terms of questions? So Jess is a research scientist at the New York State DEC, as well as an entomologist, and she works mainly in the Forest Health Diagnostic Lab. Jess, if you want to just give a little background on your role thus far with southern pine beetle on Long Island and in New York State, that would be great.
Sure.
Thank you for being here. Really appreciate your participation.
Yeah, of course. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, I've been involved with the SPB response from the beginning in various capacities in New York, but I was one of the first people out there on the ground on Long Island doing surveys and trying to assess the damage. And I was also part of the programmatic response and pulling a team together and figuring out what our priorities were. And nowadays I'm a little more focused on the trapping, both the monitoring and some research traps that we have upstate that I can talk a little bit about later, and trying to get a handle on what's going on upstate. So I have less to do with the Long Island response these days, but I'm still very much interested in it. So last time I spoke with the group for the NAFC event, which many of you are, repeat attendees from that. I talked a little bit about some of our early challenges in responding to southern pine beetle on Long Island. And today I'm going to talk about that again. I'm just going to change it up a little bit. I'm going to reiterate some of the stuff I talked about previously, but kind of hone in on some other specific challenges that I thought might be more applicable to a wider audience. I realize there's probably diverse land managers and professionals on the call that might have different needs. So I'm going to try to at least bring up things that might apply to at least most of you or some of you. So I'll get started. And, the first thing I was going to do was just briefly talk about the problem that we faced in 2014. So as many of you already know, southern pine beetle exploded on Long Island in 2014 in the fall. And the damage was significant, widespread and really rapid. And, that's the thing with southern pine beetle that you deal with that you don't deal with a lot of other pests. I mean, with most pests, something shows up and you have a little bit of time to think about it and plan ahead. And with southern pine beetle, it's like by the time you've found it, there's already thousands and thousands of trees that are dead. And that's what it was like on Long Island. I mean, within a, like Sabrina said earlier, within a 6-week period, probably over 100,000 trees had died on Long Island. And, we were just showing up to assess the damage based on reports, a couple weeks prior or whatever. And so I think, there were a lot of agencies and people that descended upon the island to see what was going on. And I think everyone was really taken aback by the extent of the damage that we were experiencing already. pitch pine is quite dominant in that area. And there was places like Connecticut State Park where within a short time frame, they lost, 75 to 85% of their pines. And at this point, it's, a lot more than that. And so I always like to just stress, the severe impact and the rapidness in which it occurs. So you really don't have that much time to prepare. So the other complication on Long Island, which maybe a lot of land managers face in other areas, is that there was a lot of diverse land ownerships involved, a lot of people, many agencies and partners involved right from the beginning. And so it was not only a matter of assessing the situation from a biological or forest management standpoint, but it was also like, how are we going to bring all these people in and make sure that everyone's objectives are considered or concerns are considered? And that was a real challenge. And also trying to then think about how you're going to manage this beetle on the landscape. And so the map on the left shows, in green where the Central Pine Barrens area is. And then some of the other areas labeled are just different places where we found it or different townships that were involved. So we have like DEC on all the state forest properties. We have the federal, the National Fish and Wildlife Service for places like Wertheim National Wildlife Refuge or Brookhaven Lab. We have state parks involved. We have Suffolk County involved, Cornell Cooperative Extension, the town of East Hampton, the town of Northampton or Riverhead, so just the partners were infinite. And early on, I think there was a lot of chaos. It was also very busy. And so in trying to prepare for a potential outbreak like this, you got to think there's many things you're going to have to address, and hit the ground running. And so on the left, it kind of shows all the things that were in our mind as we were starting to build these programs. We had to survey and characterize the damage as quickly as possible. So then we could, assess our objectives and figure out where we wanted to suppress. We started monitoring right away with traps. And then, of course, this is all new to everyone in New York. So there's training and getting a lot of people on board with what to look for. And then, of course, all the outreach. And I'll talk about that a little bit later. And luckily, we had a lot of information from the South, and that made things a little bit easier. We had a bit of a playbook to refer to, although there were differences on Long Island that we hadn't, that weren't consistent with what was happening in the South. But at the time, we didn't realize that yet. At the time, I felt like it was presenting sort of traditionally like it does in the South. And it wasn't until later that we started seeing a lot of these other nuances. And then the timeline that you see here just kind of shows an example of everything that we got done in the first year and everything that we were thinking about. And it was intense. Like I said, suppression and survey and building a team. Up in the upper right here, under surveys, outreach, traps, you see like the Northeast Forest Fire Compact crews. We were coordinating to get people from Canada and the Northeast to come down and help us. We really just needed a huge outpouring of staff support. And then, just getting to Long Island was also another matter. So early on, I think we established some priorities that have stayed pretty consistent. And I'm sharing these because these might end up being your priorities too, regardless of where you're managing this. So these are the ones that I consider the most important to address. And so identifying partners and building a team early on is really important, because like many of us, we're short-staffed and you're not going to be able to respond to this alone. So you really have to go out and seek out the people that can help and bring them into the team right away. And then, of course, you want to assess forest susceptibility to prioritize your stands for management. So, what are the most hazardous areas, or what are the most ecologically sensitive areas, and where do you want to focus your suppression work? Are there areas that are better for suppression and areas that might be better for preventative management, for example? And we spent a lot of time working on that. And then again, what are the potential costs? And then also this urban-suburban impact. Some of you may be managing stands that are just on a preserve, but in a lot of areas, you're managing pitch pine that's in an urban or suburban environment. And how are you going to interact with the landowners there and address their concerns? And then, of course, there's always the issue of funding and where are you going to get the money to do all of this? So what we did early on is build an incident command team, and that helped us a lot. And, I think one of the mistakes that we made early on was bringing in all the partners to our incident command system, and that didn't go so well. It was a little too much to keep track of. And so eventually we kind of whittled it down to the real core players on Long Island that were doing the work every day. And that was mostly, the Central Pine Barrens Commission and the Forest Service and the DEC and Suffolk County. And then everyone else kind of became a partner that they were all doing their own things. For example, like, the feds had their own management plans for their properties, and towns might have their own management plans for their properties. So then we just made a point of communicating with them, sending them updates, keeping them informed. And we developed a management plan as soon as possible. First we were responding on Long Island, and then eventually we tried to develop a statewide management plan. And, we got help from Kevin Dodds with that. So we went to the feds and, asked for their guidance in helping us. And Kevin was familiar with, the way this beetle had been managed in the South for many years. So I think, nowadays there's not only the information that still exists from the South, but there's all the stuff that all these partners have done in the North. So I think anyone that's just going into this for the first time is going to be in a good position, because you have the benefit of all the work, that we've done before, which should make it a little bit easier. I'm going to talk a little bit today about some of the things that we had to go through for the first time and some of the challenges that presented to us. So I spoke about landscape prioritization a moment ago in terms of like assessing forest susceptibility and knowing, where the most important places to work were. And for us, none of that work had been done yet. And so we had to get in there and build our own model and prioritize our own stands and figure out what we were going to do with them. And here on the left, you see what we did with Rocky Point and David Sarnoff State Forest in terms of hazard ratings. And then subsequently, we went into some of those orange and red areas and tried to do things like timber sales and do some preventative management work. But really, the point of this slide is that we had to go through all that. And now there's actually like different models out there that land managers can use. And, the most recent one that was just published was the one that I'm highlighting here on the right of the screen. That Elizabeth Jameson and Tony D'Amato and Kevin Dodds worked on. And so that is a tool that's available to land managers right now, where you can go in and collect some data and apply this model and have a pretty good idea of, which stands you're managing are the most hazardous. And this model was similar to models done in the past, where it found that, the most significant factors that determine southern pine beetle susceptibility were pitch pine basal area and distance to previous years' infestations. But the thing that came out of this model that we didn't know before was that sandy soil types also played a big role in possible impact. And that makes a lot of sense when you think about Long Island, because it's sandy soil, right? And so there's a forest structure component as well. Like sandy soils tend to have pure pine sands, which are of course going to be a little more susceptible to southern pine beetle than a mixed stand, which would be typically more found on loamy soils. And this kind of comes into play perhaps upstate too, which I'm going to talk about later when we look at the way SPB has so far played out upstate and how that's different than Long Island. Then of course you have to consider costs. And this was a big one for us. Like we were always at the drawing table, just like, what do we do about this? How do we get these trees suppressed? How do we do preventative management? There was no history of timber management on Long Island. There were no mills in proximity. Getting wood off an island is really expensive and really challenging. On Long Island, you either have to go, through the water or through New York City. And that's not ideal. There was really no timber market for pitch pine other than like a few really kind of niche people, maybe upstate, that were accepting it. We knew that Neil Gifford at the Pine Bush was selling some of his pitch pine from his thinning operations, but it was like one guy that was doing some flooring with it, which he told me yesterday that now they've switched into other uses like landscaping ties. But it's like one person that takes it upstate. We looked into like cogen and, trying to get it off the island and sent to Connecticut to, sell it for energy purposes, and that didn't really work out. And so it really comes down to cost. And so what's worked for us on Long Island so far is generally contracting the work out, and it's primarily cut and leave. And that costs about $3,000 an acre, if not more. Whereas in the South, where they're able, they're in these pine plantations where they're able to do timber sales and there's a strong market. And it generally costs them $600 to $750 an acre. And that number is actually from Mississippi, where most of the work is getting done these days. It might be a little bit more expensive for them if they're considering regeneration costs, like if they're preparing the soil for replanting and things like that. But that's a huge discrepancy. And so right away, we just knew that cost would be prohibitive. And so we've utilized a couple different things. We've used a lot of Forest Service funding. So I just wanted to list some of these things that were available for Southern pine beetle funding. And I think, John Wernet might talk about this later. I'm not sure if he was going to cover the federal part of it though. But, we've been well funded with Southern pine beetle from the Fed since the beginning. And these are all the various things that come up each year that you can potentially apply for. The Community Wildfire Defense Grant, I believe, is newer. At least to me, it's newer. And it seems like, the Forest Service is really promoting a lot of forest management practices and thinning and preventative management. And so there's a lot of funding and resources available in that department that were not there before. So that's really great. It's almost like, it seems like they're taking the model from out west with wildfire and starting to apply it more in the East and recognizing the importance of preventative management to not only mitigate fire risks, but to mitigate serious impacts from pests and diseases. In New York, we have EPF money, Environmental Protection Fund, and we use that a lot for contracts. We can't hire staff with it, but we can use it for contracts and equipment. And so hopefully you have those mechanisms, within your state as well. And so then, we go to the suburban urban side of things. And on Long Island, this is still happening. So it happened in 2014. People were freaking out. You need to anticipate an increase in emails and phone calls and press requests and interviews and presentations. Everyone's going to want to know a lot of information all within the same period of time. Back in 2014, we have a forest health email where we get diagnostic requests from the public, and it blew up, thousands of emails from homeowners on Long Island freaking out. And we'd never seen anything like it. They would have a yard full of pitch pine. It was their only tree, and they would lose all of them within 6 weeks, and then get estimates from the tree care company that it would cost $30,000 to get those trees removed. And these were people on fixed incomes and retirees, and it was just terrible to deal with. So that was sort of a unpredictable, side thing that we had to deal with. And then, of course, the press and making sure that you're presenting accurate information to the press and that they're not like misinterpreting things or getting the wrong idea. And, a lot of that happened with trying to do our first timber sales, and that being an uncomfortable subject for people on Long Island. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit in a minute. But so while we were also applying for a lot of funding, we were also finding ways simultaneously to provide funding to our more regional and local partners on Long Island to help with dead tree removal. And when Rob Cole was the incident commander of Southern Pine Beetle, him and Molly Hassett worked hard to develop these community grants. And I can't speak in too much detail about that, but I know that was a real early effort. So, you might be asked at some point, like, how are you going to address these concerns? And these are just photos from East Hampton, and this is all recent. This is from 2022. And, as they mentioned earlier, it's kind of blowing up on the South Fork. And there's people dealing with this every day in really meaningful ways. This picture was in the East Hampton News, and it showed this one neighborhood before and after SPB. And I was skeptical at first when I looked at it, and I was like, was this just like winter imagery or something? I don't know, but I picked it apart for a while and realized like this is accurate. this is how a neighborhood changed in just, 5-6 years from southern pine beetle. So outreach needs, so of course, like we wanted to get the information out there and we wanted people to know that we were doing something, because the impacts are so visible and so severe that it's easy for people to say, like, what the heck is DEC doing? But it's obviously impossible to manage in a really effective way. And so you just have to really get out there and let people know, like, we are trying and, we're working on it. And the other side of it was trying to address a lot of misconceptions, because people, they get a little traumatized by what they're seeing around them, and they start Googling and looking for solutions and then emailing you and saying, why are you not using verbenone to control southern pine beetle? I read that works, So we spent a lot of time putting reports and stuff up on our website to say, this is why we're not using verbenone. Or thinning, like I said, preventative management was very uncomfortable. When we started trying to mark timber, there was some political pressures or, public outcry over it, because they just weren't used to it on Long Island. And so we put some information out there to say, this is why preventative management is important. And, you just hope that you reach people. Some of the program managers developed kiosks and things like that, and signs and banners that would go up in front of managed areas. And we also learned a little bit about this through the Albany Pine Bush, who had been through a lot of this previously, and they managed to do aggressive forest management in the middle of like a very urban, suburban, fragmented area and get a lot of public buy-in. So we kind of used them as a model and used a lot of the strategies that they employed to get more public buy-in. And I think at this point in time, it's come a long way. And the Central Pine Barrens Commission as well has been like especially involved in that over the years. And I think everyone's made great strides since 2014. Yeah, I think that's all I was going to say about that. And then another example, so here's the banner that I just mentioned. And then of course, we worked with the Forest Service to build this demo forest at Rocky Point. And that had not only scientific benefits in terms of comparing treatments, we had 3-acre treatment blocks with thinned and burned and control plots, and to kind of assess how things would play out in each of those treatment blocks. But it was also a great outreach tool, to teach people more about preventative forest management. So, I last time I spoke only about Long Island in terms of like early challenges, but I wanted to highlight what's been going on upstate, because I know we're in a particularly unique situation in New York in the type of pitch pine that we manage here. And I think some of you may have experience with some of this as well. I'm not sure how much it applies to everyone, but we just manage a lot of different kinds of pitch pine, or not manage, but we're exposed to. So we have, the picture on the left is the Albany Pine Bush, where we're working with our partners. This is in Albany, and it's a suburban area where they're doing a lot of burning and thinning. And then we have these dwarf pine ridges in the Shawangunk Mountains up to the right. And the Shawangunk are home to a lot of like globally rare inland pitch pine systems. And the one on the bottom is a pitch pine oak forest that we've been working in that was recently burned in a wildfire. So we have all these really interesting different systems, and we've been monitoring southern pine beetle for years in these systems, and it hasn't played out the way it's played out on Long Island. And so I think it's important to recognize that and say, when you have something like Long Island that maybe in a lot of ways presents the same way it does down south, like there's an outbreak and it spreads fast and you try to contain it. And upstate, it's been different. And we think, as Sabrina mentioned, it's probably because of the cold temperatures, but we've seen some strange patterns. Like we know it's everywhere, it seems like. We found it at many, many locations. And these pitch pine stands are not the contiguous, dense pitch pine stands that we have on Long Island. They are small and isolated and diffuse, and sometimes not very pitch pine dominant. There might be just a handful of mature pitch pine trees with mostly these 4-foot tall dwarf pine trees, and yet we'll catch 1,000 southern pine beetles at that site. And then when we go back to look for them, we don't find them anywhere. We see no sign of them whatsoever. And so, like I say here, it's diverse and it's unpredictable. So we don't know how to prepare for that. And it's really just like a waiting game of monitoring and asking questions and saying, like, what do we think is going to happen next year? And how do we prepare for that? And then most of the time we're wrong. So like last year, you know, we've been trapping, and Kevin's going to talk about the trapping later, but we've been trapping for years. And we noticed suddenly that all of our numbers went way up. And it wasn't surprising, because typically when we see an increase like this, we look back at the weather data and we've seen that the winter temperature, the minimum winter temperature, was not cold enough. And so it wasn't surprising that the numbers went up. But then we kind of jumped on it and we thought, like, this is our time to study southern pine beetle upstate, and we're probably going to have a spring emergence, and it's going to start looking a little bit more like it does on Long Island, where we start getting, you know, discoloration in the spring and spot expansion through the summer. And of course, none of that happened. And we put traps up in all the locations where we caught the highest amount of beetles, and we found nothing. And now we're into the fall and we're still trapping, and so likely we'll detect some now, because this is the time of year that we do. But it was just really interesting. And so it just goes to show you, you know, perhaps cold temperatures are knocking populations back. I think there's other things at play, like the soil types. Perhaps trees are a little bit more resilient or able to pitch out the southern pine beetle. We've theorized that a lot of these sites are on ridges where perhaps the pheromones are not like settled in as much, and they're able to disperse more quickly. And so the southern pine beetle don't really get a chance to aggregate as much as they would in a closed canopy system. Or perhaps because these stands are so diffuse, perhaps they disperse in the fall and then they just can't find another host and they just run out of energy and die. We don't know. And we're working hard to answer these questions. But I think the take-home message is that you might be stuck in more of a system like this, where you don't have like a traditional playbook, and you just kind of have to play it by ear and see what's going to happen from year to year. And so, yeah, at this point, I guess I was hoping some people had questions. And that's all I have. Chat, I guess, you know, what I would be curious to know is from those on the call, what, I know there are a lot of land managers, like what kind of pitch pine systems are you working in? Like, is it suburban or is it just in a preserve? You know, I guess it would be interesting to know what the crowd is out there. Are you like a county land manager, or are you like managing fire in pitch pine, you know? If anyone feels like sharing that information.
We do have a couple of questions in the chat. John Green, is there much regrowth after SVB, like after fires?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the area. On Long Island, its regeneration is a big challenge because of deer pressure mainly. And so I would have the Long Island people maybe speak to that a little bit better, but I would guess that deer pressure is a huge factor and that regeneration is very challenged. The areas that I see upstate, it's not so much of an issue. And in wildfire areas, we typically see pretty good pitch pine regen, and at the Pine Bush as well in Albany, I know. I mean, they focus on regeneration, so I think it's pretty rigorous in their areas. So I see Polly's on, she could answer that. Hi, Polly.
Hi, how you doing? Great presentation, Jess. So regarding the question about regrowth after SPB and fire, you know, it is a question that we're looking to answer, and we submitted with the UVM and the Forest Service, as well as other partners on Long Island, to study what's happening with pitch pine regeneration post southern pine beetle, but also with management, both prescribed fire and mechanical treatment. So that's a study that we're hoping to have results on in a couple of years. I will say, in a study that we had done with pitch pine planting, is that deer browse is an issue on pitch pines, not just on deciduous trees, oaks, etc. We are finding that they will browse on pitch pine and to, if you are doing pitch pine plantings, that you may need to put in deer guards to exclude the deer from the pitch pine. So hopefully we'll have some more answers on the status of pitch pine regeneration, but I'll talk a little bit more about some of our concerns related to prescribed fire and balancing the effects of prescribed fire in regeneration as it relates to southern pine beetle risk.
We have another question in the chat by Danielle. You mentioned the public requesting the use of an herbicide, but you don't recommend it. Just curious why.
Well, I think the verbenone wasn't an herbicide. It's like Kevin, maybe you can speak better to this, but it's like an anti-aggregation chemical, I think, where it's supposed to prevent aggregation of southern pine beetle in certain areas. And so it does work well, perhaps for like, you know, if you have a few trees that you're trying to protect, but it wasn't something that could be applied to a forest setting and done at a large scale. So that's why I guess it wasn't that we didn't recommend it, but that we just said we're not utilizing this because we can't make this happen on a landscape level scale. And even with any pesticide that might be really effective for southern pine beetle, again, we can't use it on a landscape level scale. Plus Long Island had its own concerns because, you know, it just so happened that the most severe impact was in this ecologically sensitive area that also sits over a giant aquifer that provides drinking water to most of the island. And so there were water quality issues as well in terms of applying pesticides in great quantities. So just correct me if I said anything wrong about the verbenone.
Hey, Jeff. Hi, everybody. No, you didn't say anything incorrect. You know, verbenone has not really been all that effective, or there's a lot of variation in its effectiveness in protecting trees. So, and then I think also in New York, and this may be in other states too, it was regulated as an insecticide, even though it's an anti-attractant for bark beetles. And, you know, in other systems like Douglas fir beetle, there's anti-attractants that, you know, can completely shut down an infestation, but that's never really borne out with southern pine beetle for some reason. So, and then just jumping back to the other question about regen after southern pine beetle, and I think the real key is looking at, you know, what happens before southern pine beetle in a way, right? So if a stand is properly managed, it's, you know, in terms of pitch pine, if there's fire in there, disturbance, then you do have really good regen. And then it doesn't really matter if the overstory is killed off. It's unfortunate, but you lose that overstory. If the stands have been managed okay before that, then you have that next sort of cohort or multiple cohorts that are going to come up and move eventually into the overstory. But the problem that we see now, right, is that so many areas have not really been managed in any, you know, at least on Long Island. And so when southern pine beetle comes through and kills off the overstory, that's it for pitch pine in those stands. There's nothing in the understory unless there's like, you know, some sort of restoration effort with planting or something. You're really probably not going to get pitch pine there for a long time. And so, you know, we're doing that field tour at the end of the month. Some of that's going to be on Brookhaven, and you'll see a lot of the work that Kathy's done there, where there have been sort of preventative treatments, not focused on southern pine beetle at that point, but just sort of restoration treatments, and you'll see good regen and what like a restored forest can look like.
We have one more question in the chat. Juliana, she has seen SPB damaged sites becoming overtaken by cat briar. I don't know if that's something we should try to manage or let it run its course.
On Long Island specifically? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know much about cat briar. Does anyone on the call know how to answer that? I mean, I would guess just in general, invasive control is going to be an important factor in any post-outbreak forest, but easier said than done, right? I think it ties into your objectives and what you have, you know, what you've chosen to address and what you have the resources to address. I certainly think it should always be part of it. but not knowing like what goes into that control, it's hard for me to say.
I think it depends on if you're doing prescribed fire management and what kind of access. It can really limit the ability to get in and access the area safely, but it also can serve as a ladder fuel for prescribed fire. So it would need to be treated to reduce the control of the fires, or to improve the control of the fires and reduce rapid spread of the fire or ladder fires. So I think as Jess alluded to, it's really based on your priorities for managing impacted sites as opposed to possibly trying to advance suppression on other newly infested sites and what resources you have available.
Alrighty, well, with that, I guess we'll move into the next presentation. Thank you for your questions, and thank you to Polly, Jess, and Kevin for your great answers. So moving on, this is a good segue into determining forest susceptibility in anticipation of southern pine beetle moving northward. So Rob Cole, who's a forester with New York State DEC Division of Lands and Forests, as well as Jason Denham, who's a supervising forester with the DEC Bureau of Invasive Species and Ecosystem Health. They're going to be giving us an overview of determining forest susceptibility. So if you both want to introduce yourselves and your role thus far with southern pine beetle, and then we'll roll right into your presentation.
Hi, I'm Rob Cole, a forester and certified arborist with New York State DEC. I started out with southern pine beetle about a year into it, taking on the incident command and running the management for a couple of years. And I assume Jason can introduce himself when he starts talking. So I'm going to get right into it. The data collection for decision making. So there are pretty much 4 key things you need to know if southern pine beetle is headed your direction or nearby somewhere. And those things are where your pitch pine is, and that seems obvious, but for us it wasn't so obvious. And then the size of your pitch pine, what you've got, and we deal with a multiple ranges of sizes. How dense your forest is, because that impacts the pheromones, as Jess was talking about, and then where southern pine beetle is exactly in the area, because that impacts whether or not you're going to want to get into a stand and do some management and start stressing it out, before it's more resilient in the long run. So starting with the first one, where your pitch pine is. So when we found out that there was southern pine beetle on Long Island, in the Long Island Pine Barrens, we said, oh, the Long Island Pine Barrens, that's like 50,000 some odd acres of pitch pine. That's all susceptible. Holy cow, that's a lot. How are we going to deal with that? And then when we really, you really got to narrow it down. So this is, and I'm using this Rocky Point Pine Barren State Forest as an example. Jess already had the hazard map up of this, and I think Jason's going to use it as an example for the hazard mapping. So this is a piece of state land that DEC manages, and it's approximately 6,000 acres. And so again, we've narrowed ourselves down to the 6,000 acres because we're the state, so we're looking at state lands within that greater 50,000 acres. And it's called Pine Barren State Forest. So again, we're assuming this is all pitch pine barrens. And so that's like a lot to work with. We need to narrow it down more. And so you really need to know where the pitch pine is in those areas. So this is the ortho imagery from Google. And you can see that even though it's the Pine Barrens State Forest, there's actually a lot of land in there that is, let's see. All right, so you can see the border is right here where I'm outlining. It goes down there, around back up here. So even though it's all called Pine Barrens, you can see there are large areas of hardwood. So we have to dig a little deeper And so really to get down to this susceptibility and hazard modeling and really determining what's going on in your stands, you do need to complete like a legitimate forest inventory. So, DEC, we're foresters, land managers, so we're used to going out and doing inventory plots and things like that. But if you're on a smaller preserve or something where maybe you don't get into like straight forestry measurements, for some of this, that really is going to be helpful. So we went from that 6,000 acre property and we did a forest inventory and we mapped the stands. And then we came out something like this. So we actually realized it wasn't 6,000 acres. Maybe only half of the acreage had pitch pine. So when you're out there doing your forest inventory, there's some very specific data that you're going to need to run some of this modeling and go through the formulas. So you're going to need DBH of these plots. And we're doing, we used variable radius plots. We did prism plots so we could collect basal area because you're going to need that. And then you're measuring all the trees, the diameter as you go through those plots. You can also, while you're out there in the field, in doing your inventory, you can collect trees per acre data, or you can calculate that back at the office. So now we've kind of identified where the pitch pine are. And this also gave us the density because we did basal area and trees per acre. So now we know all of our stands, even that have pitch pine, they're not necessarily all created equally. And this again is really important because we're moving, we're talking about hazard modeling, which the end goal of that is preventative actions, thinning in these stands, so that when the pheromone plume moves in, it disperses a lot. When there's SPB there, it's not all caught in the understory. So when we're looking at this susceptibility, that differs based on those densities. So here you can just see in the upper right-hand corner, that stand is going to end up with a different rating based on the data you collected. As you can see there, there's a lot of hardwood mixed in, and the pitch pine look larger, as opposed to the red oval there in the lower left, where it's smaller trees all packed right in. So this is very important when you're looking for the pre-SPB treatment. You really need to know where these different kinds of stands are, because your management is going to change heavily throughout. And then the last thing you really need to know is where southern pine beetle is and how far it is from the locations where you're thinking about doing some of this thinning to increase pine health and stand resiliency. So you need to have a really good survey of where SPB is. This is just an example, one of our aerial survey maps. And in the corner here, this is that Rocky Point Pine Barren State Forest we were looking at before. So if you're going to do preventative thinning, you don't want to do it, say, over here on a piece of land, because there's so much pressure from southern pine beetle already. The preventative thinning is great in the long run. However, in the short term, you are stressing the stand because you're going in there, you're removing trees, you're driving over roots. You might, as you're taking down some trees, you might damage other trees. So there is that initial stress of 1 to 2 years. So you don't want to be doing that when southern pine beetles, in the forest, half a mile down the road or something, because you're probably going to get hit, and those two stressors together might actually end up killing more trees instead of saving them. So we had chosen this Rocky Point area because it was very limited. We were able to cut these out. This data is several years old at this point. But we thought we had a good area to work in here. And then, so this is what I'm talking about, what you want to avoid. You can come in and do a great thinning, thin out the pitch pine, leave some nice ones. But if there's SPB right down the road, you've stressed them. And instead of having a nice thin open stand of pitch pine, you'll end up with this, where you made a nice open stand and then they come in and attack it. So yeah, those are really the 4 things you need to know: where your pitch pine is, how dense it is, how big it is, and how far SPB away is. And if you know those things, you can start running through calculations to determine the hazard and more susceptibility of your stands. So Now I'm going to turn it over to Jason Denham, and he's going to talk specifically about the hazard modeling that we did at DEC on Long Island.
Thanks, Rob. While I'm introducing myself, I'm going to pull up the my slides here. I am also a DEC forester with Lands and Forests in Albany. Rob and I both share the exact same title and the exact same work unit. It's interesting how we introduced ourselves slightly differently, but we actually have a lot more in common than that. Okay, so I am going to be talking about basically how DEC developed our southern pine beetle hazard models during the time period starting back in 2015 and up through around 2018. As Jess has already mentioned, there are a number of available academic papers and existing hazard models that you can use to develop your own hazard maps of your own properties. I'm not here to claim the benefits of our method over anyone else's for your specific situation, but I do want to sort of take you through the process that we went through, and hopefully that will help some of you if you are in an effort to evaluate and create your own hazard model for your own lands. I also want to acknowledge that most of the heavy lifting for this work was done by two people who are no longer working on southern pine beetle with us, Scott McDonald and Molly Hassett. So picture me as the middle schooler giving the book report on the great work that was done by those two. Okay, so first thing is, again, here's Rocky Point State Forest and David Sarnoff, Pine Barren State Forest. Both of these hazard maps were developed using the DEC model. I'll take you through that process. But before I do, I wanted to talk about whether or not we use this as a predictive tool or a prioritization tool. A lot of the hazard models that were developed and used in southern states on very large land areas have some predictive value to them. For us, this was really basically a way to prioritize which stands we should do some treatments in to reduce the overall SPB risk by thinning, burning, or other methods. And so you'll see that this is rated from lowest to highest. It's not really an absolute scale. It's really meant for us to compare one stand to its neighbors so that we can decide where our efforts and dollars would be best spent in preventative work. Here's just another version. This is actually a slightly different run of the model with some adjustments made for the different data set that we had for statewide. Just wanted to mention, scale makes a difference. If you are trying to manage southern pine beetle across an entire state versus across an individual property or an area the size of the Pine Barrens of Long Island, you might make different choices about what model would be best for you, and you might also have different data available to you. Okay, so you're going to see versions of this picture again, I suspect, but I just wanted to stress before we get into the heavy math, the reason we do the math is the southern pine beetle behavior. They are attracted to stressed out host trees, and they are attracted to each other. They're attracted to the pheromones they produce that say, hey, here's some stressed out host trees, let's go get them. Everything else that I'm going to talk about and the numbers that you're going to see on the screen all comes back to an attempt to quantify these two things. What is the likelihood that this stand has stressed out pitch pine trees, stressed out other host trees, and is in a condition where those pheromone plumes are likely to hang around for a longer time and result in a mass attack of southern pine beetle. I'm afraid that you're going to see some stuff coming up that looks a lot like math homework. Just remember, it's all about these two factors, and try to hang with me through the rough part. Okay, so here's an example just of of what a high risk stand might look like. This is actually a picture from Texas, but there are stands equally dense on Long Island. This is probably well over 120 square feet basal area of host pine. This isn't pitch pine. This is probably shortleaf or loblolly pine. I'm not sure. I'm going to show you a picture of a nice open, low risk pitch pine stand coming up. But first, we're going to get to the math here. So again, I am not the person who developed these, and I'm not even the best forest statistician in this panel of presenters. So I'm really just trying to talk about what we used and what you could potentially use to produce your own risk map or hazard model map. Some of these things Rob's already talked about: basal area per acre, trees per acre, or pitch pine or host trees per acre. And then there's a couple of new terms I'm going to throw at you that go into our formula, and I'm going to show the work. So quadratic mean diameter is not the same thing as the arithmetic mean, or what we traditionally would think of as the average diameter of a stand. Why do we use quadratic mean diameter in our formula? Two reasons. One, there are certain mathematical advantages to doing it that way that I'm not going to delve into, both for lack of time and lack of expertise. But it's also a measurement that is traditionally been used a lot in forest mensuration for a long time. So it's well known among forest statisticians. And so it's been used in past models for that reason as well. The other term is stand density index, which I'm going to say SDI. And that is just an index number that is produced by combining the three factors above: the basal area, the trees per acre, the quadratic mean diameter, all go into producing a number or stand density index, and that stand density index became part of our hazard model. Okay, so don't worry, there's not a test on this. A lot of this is available on the internet, and you can find this. You don't have to worry about taking notes. So these are the actual formulas that we used in developing our model. Quadratic mean diameter, and I don't know how to make the square root symbol in a PowerPoint slide, but it's just the square root of the basal area or host basal area of the stand in this case, times a constant. And this is the constant that you'd use for standard English units. All of our inventory data and everything, this is all in inches and feet. So if you're using centimeters and meters, you would have a different constant. For us, it was 0.005454 times n, where n is the number of trees sampled. Rob mentioned doing variable radius prism plots. You're counting the number of trees that are in your plot, and that becomes your n in this calculation. But this actually also happens to work out conveniently to be the diameter of a tree that has the arithmetic mean basal area. So if you have the basal area of all the individual trees, which you can get from the diameter of all the individual trees, you can actually work backwards and arrive at this same number through different calculation. The SDI or stand density index that we used was simply the trees per acre times the quadratic mean over 10 to the power of 1.605. Again, this is, I did not develop this equation. I'm not going to be able to speak in great depth about why that is the factor, but that's available, from the literature. Just trust us that this is what we used, and it worked for us in terms of producing a useful model. All right, hang with me there. It's going to get rough. This is it. This is the actual recipe that DEC used. Essentially, the greenish numbers on the left are just weighting factors. They add up to 100 and helped us to produce an overall hazard rating for each stand between 0 and 10. We calculated 3 hazard scores, one based on the basal area of pitch pine, one based on the quadratic mean diameter, or the QMD, and one based on the stand density index, which those are shown on the right-hand side of your screen. We had a default maximum value for all of these individuals scores as 10 because we wanted to produce a model that rated each stand on with a number from 0 to 10. And anything over 10 would be extraordinarily hazardous anyway. So we had some raw data. This is our actual forest inventory data from, I think, Rocky Point. No, this one is from Sarnoff. But you'll see we have a mean stand diameter for each stand. We have the number of acres of stand, we have the total basal area, we have the trees per acre, and we have the pitch pine basal area. So specifically, we have a total basal area, but also the basal area of just what is a host tree for southern pine beetle. All of this was in the forest inventory data that that was collected that Rob discussed. I've hidden a bunch of other columns for other data that were unimportant for this calculation, but this is all the stuff we basically used. Basically put it into an Excel spreadsheet, and then mostly Molly, with some help from me, created this calculation. So you can do this. If you have this data, you can punch in those formulas or with whatever weights you determine work best for your situation into just a simple Excel spreadsheet. Have the spreadsheet do those calculations for you and weight all of those factors for you. And the final column on the right here is just a weighted hazard score between 0 and 10 for all of those stands. All right, that's the last slide. I think that looks like math homework. I hope I haven't put everybody completely to sleep with that. The point is, this is something that you can do with the tools you probably have on your computer, as long as you have those basic details of data that Rob discussed to start with. So finally, we produced a hazard rating map, and this is again example from Rocky Point, showing the demonstration areas that Jess has discussed. And for those of you who do go to the outdoor session later this month, you will be visiting these blocks, and you can see for yourself the difference between the higher hazard rating stands and those lower rated stands or green stands just to the south from where those high hazard blocks are. I'd encourage you to take a look around as you're traveling up into those demonstration areas, and I think you'll be able to see a major difference on the ground between what scores highly and what does not. So here is your pretty example of a beautiful open low hazard rating pitch pine barren stand. If you're curious about the gentleman in the picture there, that is my old college forest mensuration professor, Joe Mawson, who was the person who taught me to refer to forest statistics as forest sadistics. So I thought it was appropriate that I include him in my talk. Thanks so much for hanging with me through the math. And I think now Rob and I can answer any questions if there are.
Neil asks in the chat, "Hi Jason, great work. Where was that closest shot? Nice stand density."
Neil, I think you're asking that question for a very specific reason, because I think that's in the Albany pine bush, if I'm not mistaken.
Tooting his own horn there.
Well deserved.
Yes, absolutely.
I can see the question from Helen regarding the mixed stand and what matters is total basal area, not only pitch pine. We had a couple of different versions of the model that looked at total basal area as well as just pitch pine basal area. And what we found, at least for Long Island, is the total basal area, or the amount of hardwood that was in there with the pitch pine, because it was primarily oak in those cases, did make a difference in terms of the southern pine beetle result. And our hypothesis is that is just a reflection of the overall competition that those trees were under, so the stress that the host trees were under. So in most of those stands, the number of pitch pine basal area and the total basal area were both high. So it's not like, if you have a stand that's got like 80 basal area of oak and just a little bit of pitch pine, that might be a different story.
Hi, I'm Nate Hudson.
This meeting is being recorded.
The meeting is now being recorded, so I'll say I'm Nate Hudson again. I've worked on southern pine beetle since 2015. I was on some of the first crews of our DEC staff who went down to do cutting and suppression. And since then, I've been working a lot of southern pine beetle, and I've moved on in various different levels, from running operations to incident command to what we're doing now, which is more of a management and thinning, preventative management and thinning. So I'll get right into talking about that and get my PowerPoint up here. It's very important. So here's what we do with all that. So we identify stands of high risk. Like this one was a high risk stand just south of Kearns Field in Rocky Point. This is a drone image Polly took, and you can see our thinning and our space trees. This was a cut and I'll get into the different types. This was a cut and remove thinning, and perhaps some of you might visit this stand in the future. So preventative thinning, you have susceptible forest. We just went through some presentations on how we determine a susceptible forest. We have some options. We can do restorative management and then maintain that system. And that can restore native forest structures, increase diversity, lower fire risk, lower SPV outbreak risk, and increased climate resilience. Or we can choose to do nothing, or we can choose to do worse, which is nothing plus fire suppression, which is essentially the history of most forest lands on Long Island. And that'll increase wildfire risk, increase hazardous forest conditions, low plant diversity, low animal diversity, and a tinderbox that is not very climate resilient. So is southern pine beetle really that bad? Yes, it is. This is a cul-de-sac on Wireless Way out in Southampton on a property complex we call Great Hill. This entire property was wiped out in a summer's time, and I'll talk about this in my next presentation, but this can happen in such a short number of weeks. You pull up here and all these trees are green. You come 3 weeks later and they look like this. All right, so the goals of our management, as I kind of outlaid on that first slide. First, this is to decrease the risk of southern pine beetle outbreak. We do that by reducing the basal area between 60 and 80. A lot of the forests that are in that high risk category are above 100, even up to some being 190 to 200. And if you know a lot about basal area, that's dense. You can't even have room for your shoulders to fit between the trees. Reducing that understory density, which also allows the wind to come in, scrub oak mastication, woody brush removal, that kind of thing with the understory density. This is to reduce wildfire risk, facilitate and increase RX fire safety. That's a big one. A lot of our work is to facilitate that safety in building fire lines and fire breaks, getting rid of some fuel, jackpot fuels, and that sort of thing, reducing ladder fuels in prepping burn sites. And then to increase pitch pine recruitment and creating a mixed age class system from a more even age class system. And then increase plant and animal diversity and improve forest resiliency. So the silvicultural treatments, all of our treatments, that's the first requirement is to get that basal area below 80. We're really shooting for that 60 number and creating a mosaic, that mosaic of between 40 up to 60. So there's some parts that are more open, some parts that are more closed, and kind of working with the forest that's there, the trees that are there to kind of create that natural system. And then this is to disperse the pheromone plumes, the southern pine beetle, as we've talked about. So, and then mastication, that's using the forestry mulcher. This is to help disperse pheromone plumes by removing that scrub oak layer. As you can see in the before and after, scrub oak can get 14 feet tall and make things impenetrable, lower fuels, and increase RX safety. So we have the thinning. We've done any number of combinations, and I'm going to run through some of the stuff we've done. With thinning, we basically have cut and leave, which is where we cut the trees and leave them on site, and then cut and remove, which is where we have them cut and then they get taken off site. And we've experienced some issues with costs of cut and remove. So, and then we have mastication, which we have whole tree mastication, which we've not done on Long Island yet. And then we have understory mastication. And this is our forestry mulcher there. And it just loves that upper photo of those young scrubby pines and scrub oaks. It's a machine designed to eat that. So I'll go through and talk about some of the areas that we've worked. We've thinned around 300 acres now and done various combinations, but it all kind of boils down to you're thinning, you're either cutting and leaving that material, so all that material is left on site, or you're able to remove some of that. So this is a cut and leave before image. This is pretty typical of what we see southern pine beetle really liking, where you have a decent mixed oak and pine with younger oak and older pine kind of in the overstory. And then this is what a cut and leave looks afterwards. So all that material is left. This is mostly for southern pine beetle prevention. So getting the air in there to disperse the pheromones, giving the trees a little more space, giving them more resources. This is mastication, cut and leave. So this is the same. This is just where we've done the understory mastication. We haven't done the cut yet. So as you can see, there's some trees in there that are marked, ready to go. And we've been in there with the forestry mulcher and mulch the understory. This is what we do mostly when we do this with our in-house crews. And then we come and you can see where we've masticated the understory, and then we've done that cut and leave. And you have all that material left. So this is the scrub oak system. Like, you have these 14-foot high scrub oaks with scattered trees, and it just has beautiful results when you come and use our forestry mulcher to mow that all down. And then it comes right back. This is the same season, so you do that in the winter time, and by July it really starts to resemble what we would consider a typical pine barrens with just a treatment, and it makes things much safer. It alleviates, gets rid of those ladder fuels, and we've done that in quite a few areas now. Wow, you can't see what it is. The label is cut off on my screen, at least. This is the ideal situation, and I believe we'll be going to this site at the end of the month in Rocky Point. This is a cut and remove, and then a few years later it was burnt, and then this is what has happened, after the fire, what has allowed the grasses to come back in. So some lessons learned with preventative management, and this first one, landscape scale. Initially our thinnings, we were picking out those we have gone through the processes where how we determine the hazardous stands, where we think southern pine beetle is going to attack. And then we go there and we do which I'll talk about later, our aerial surveys and our suppression. And we find that southern pine beetle doesn't follow any of those rules that we want to make for it. So initially we were doing thinnings where we were doing kind of picking those high hazard stands and doing thinnings. Again, this works on a landscape scale. So you may have high hazard stands that are directly next to, in fact, this situation where this picture is taken. You're looking at a cut and leave in the background, a cut and leave high hazard stand that was essentially dog hair pitch pine, young, scrubby pitch pine. And it was directly next to that previous stand of the scrub oak mastication. And while we're in there, we're working on the landscape, and we're not just working on those high hazard stands. So we're doing this cut and leave thinning of this pine stand. And at the same time, while we're there and our crews are out there, we're getting that mastication done of that scrub oak stand so that it's safer for RX fire in the future. And we're building our thinnings off of each other so that eventually we're producing a full landscape that is managed, as opposed to picking out all these different stands. So some of the struggles we have with our cut and leave, leaving that carbon on there is we have the increased organic matter, which doesn't produce the bare mineral soils needed for regeneration. And a lot of those, when they're masticated, don't engage with the fire. So both any of the chips produced aren't consumed during RX fire, and then also the heavy fuels, they tend to not engage and produce large flame lengths or any hazardous conditions during the fire, but they do increase the effort it takes to mop up those fires and increases the need for smoke management. And on Long Island, those two things are important because we have to have 100% smoke out, and there's houses and people for where that column is going. So a few things we've learned over the last few years with this. That is all I have, and we're going to switch over to Polly and then take combined questions over.
Perfect. All right, so I'm Polly Weigand. I'm the Science and Stewardship Program Manager for the Central Pine Barrens. In 2018, we were awarded prescribed fire funding through the DEC in response to southern pine beetle outbreak and the recognized decline of forest health, as well as the high wildland fire risk that we have on Long Island, combined with the high wildland urban interface. And part of what we were seeing with southern pine beetle and its forest susceptibility was the fact that there hadn't been any active management on the Pine Barrens in quite some time. There had been some attempts made in the 2000s that fizzled out. And so this program was really, the prescribed fire program was in response to that southern pine beetle and really kickstarted the active fire management on Long Island. I'd say it's actually been a little bit of a silver lining of bringing to the forefront of the importance of management, both through mechanical treatments and thinning, and using prescribed fire both as a preventative measure for improving forest health and resiliency, but also in response to southern pine beetle suppression. And so when we're talking about a fire-prone ecosystem, as the Central Pine Barrens is, and an area where we have massive wildfire suppression, it seems to be very common sense, supported by science, of course, that putting in and utilizing prescribed fire behind these thinning treatments that the state has been advancing, completes that ecological cycle to maximize forest health and forest resiliency to emerging insect species, as well as those that are constant pressure. So as Dave Taff highlighted, there are these neonatives like southern pine beetle that are continuing to expand their range related to climate change. And so the more we can actively manage our forests proactively, the more resilient they'll be, not only to southern pine beetle, but other pressures as well. So I'm going to share a little bit about what we've been finding with southern pine beetle. So, looking at prescribed fire, the management goals, as I've talked about, the resiliency to improving the forest health is, that releasing of nutrients, reducing the competition, directly as it relates to southern pine beetle, reducing the basal area. So it provides the dual benefit to increasing the tree's health and also dispersing the pheromones to make the forest more resilient to the potential of infestation. It also, from an ecological sense, many people know, maintains those key fire adaptations and that genetic variability of the population to then otherwise have fitness to adapt to these outbreaks as they move forward. And then it also helps with the dissipation of those pheromones, reducing those understory fuels, further reducing competition and space for resources that allows the pitch pines to pitch out the southern pine beetle when a infestation or outbreak occurs. And the motto that I think John Wernet keyed was, keeping the pines in the pine barrens. The Central Pine Barrens name is core to having pines in the pine barrens, and we have seen mass die off here, and quite alarming. We've had a resurgence this year, and if you join us on the field trip, you'll have firsthand experience of this situation. But it's also, the resiliency and the forest health and tying in the prescribed fire component is also key, because we're seeing the transition of many of these forest areas with wildfire suppression converting and succeeded into these mesic ecosystems that are oak, hickory, white pine dominated, and also transitioning from the early successional phases of the pine barrens because fire has not been able to be put on the ground. So utilizing prescribed fire completes that cycle. It further helps to reduce the basal area. Even if the basal area of your forest thinning is a little high, through natural mortality related to prescribed fire, you can experience additional reduction in basal areas. It helps to reduce that understory density. It also can stimulate the pitch pine recruitment, and the goal is the creation of middle-age stand classes. So one little caution or precaution that I'll talk about a little bit further is, we want to make sure that we're not setting up this stand for dense dog-haired recruitment that then turns back into beetle bait and would support further outbreaks of southern pine beetle. So managing prescribed fire in a frequent manner in order to thin out those densely responding pitch pine stands. And then obviously for prescribed fire, we're also looking to further benefit plant and animal diversity, enriching the forest, bringing recruitment of those early successional species that we see as increasingly being elevated to threatened and endangered because of habitat loss, because of the loss of this key disturbance regimen, and really reducing the organic matter, the fuels for the wildfire hazard, and then also the dust to expose the mineral soils that are key to opening niches for species like the coastal buck moss, as well as new plant species as well. So how does prescribed fire benefit southern pine beetle? A great study by John Nowak and James Meeker was published that demonstrated in the south that through the thinning of the understory vegetation and the overstory, using prescribed fire helps to dissipate the pheromone plumes, again, makes the pitch pine forest more resilient, the trees in themselves more resilient to southern pine beetle invasion. And it's through those ecosystem modification activities that improves the resilience to southern pine beetle. But the direct burning of the forest does not reduce or inflict general southern pine beetle mortality in a way to suppress the population. So the pitch pine tree's bark is too insulating to kill the southern pine beetle. It may kill southern pine beetle if the tree is consumed with fire and kills the pine tree, but unless you have a very intense fire that results in the consumption of all your trees that are infested, you're not going to have a reduction directly in southern pine beetle mortality. It really helps to reduce that susceptibility to the forest by doing this active management. And in the chat button, I inserted the study that John had developed and published so that you can download that. So now I'm going to move into some of the challenges with conducting prescribed fire related some of the southern pine beetle proposed challenges that we have seen with conducting prescribed fire. And the first really is southern pine beetle blows through a stand. You end up with dead standing trees. That then is a long-term issue that you need to address. So it really provides and highlights and illustrates the importance of managing preventatively to help mitigate the development of these high hazard stands. In addition, with the amount of standing fuel that's dry, you have an increased, perhaps temporary wildfire risk associated with that. But if conditions align correctly in just such a way, that is a higher concern that we have. In addition, as Nate mentioned, the higher volume of heavies is much more challenging to mitigate, especially on the ground, and to remove them, to reduce the amount of organic matter through mastication. That's a high cost to do that, and or to do mastication of affected stands that are dead and standing. There's a high hazard associated with that material. So, and also Nate mentioned, he stole my thunder a little bit, but that's okay, is just that these heavy fuels on the ground also make for challengement with smoke management. When they do engage in the fire, they produce a lot of smoldering and a lot of mop-up challenges. So you not only have the investment of staff time to do the mop-up to put the smoke out, but also the higher smoke management challenges to reduce the exposure to the community related to mop-up and overall operational success. And then, southern pine beetle moves quickly, and burn plans take a lot of effort and time in which to get them executed and available to be put on the ground. And so it's not something that you can say, oh, we have southern pine beetle here, we want to do a burn plan. It's really important to be able to do that proactive planning related to prescribed fire management as it relates to southern pine beetle. So conversely, some of the challenges in conducting prescribed fire that we found related to southern pine beetle management is something that I think everyone in the Northeast can relate to, is the access to burn bosses and contractors. So very limited contractors that can be hired to implement prescribed fire proactively or reactively to southern pine beetle and forest health. And then also agencies having available burn bosses to lead and implement those fires as well. Prescribed fire on top of mechanical treatment, ecologically beneficial, is another layer of cost. And for many of these first entry burns in our unmanaged forest, mastication and thinning is needed. So you have the dual cost of mastication before you're transitioning into a maintenance phase using prescribed fire. Climate change, this year we've had a drought. We've also experienced higher levels of rainfall that are changing the seasonality and the propensity for us to be able to conduct prescribed fires proactively. I would also add in COVID, that really tied back our abilities in the last 2 years to put fire on the ground in staffing regimens. And then, we are challenged as well with the concept of T&E species listings and recognizing that we're trying to manage a habitat for these declining species, and some of the restrictions, while we recognize that those are important, also conflict with these larger forest health management issues where we're trying to improve the habitat. So trying to balance those needs, both of the forest, the long-term lack of forest management, and then the trends related to saving and protecting these declining species. I guess mentioning further, when we are conducting these prescribed fires, our goal is to reduce the duff in the mineral soils and having the fuels to do that. And when we put fire on the ground, especially these first entry burns, we're burning up a lot of the fine fuels and the smaller fuels, the 1 hour fuels, but we're exposing some of the duff through consumption, but there's such a buildup of duff over time that we need to be able to really burn these forests repetitively to burn back the duff. We have 6 layers thick. It almost looks like potting soil, potting material at some point, or peat rather. And it's very hard to have enough fuels on the ground to carry fire to consume that dust and help to expose the soil so that you're having pitch pine recruitment. So when we talk about prescribed fire and management, we really start off with that restoration, getting the ecosystem to where we want it to be, and then transitioning to maintenance. And I think the maintenance component, when you think about southern pine beetle, is really important because we want to improve the forest health, and generally through that disturbance, if we're managing it correctly and able to expose that soil, we're going to have high densities of pitch pine recruitment. So continually putting prescribed fire back on the ground to thin out those stands, so you're reducing the pitch pine to a basal area of 60, but then also generating a uneven age class stand so that you're maximally mitigating the effects of southern pine beetle. Southern pine beetle really likes those even age stands and dense stands. So if you can reduce those down both in density and change their age class, that's critically important. And I'd also illustrate too with Nate's, the scrub oak recruitment and regeneration is we're masticating the scrub oak at this point to reduce the fire hazard. But if you're managing similar to the Albany pine bush, you may need to take further actions through the application of herbicide to reduce the scrub oak densities so that you have enough niches that are open to have the species that you desire in your stand and system. So scrub oak is very resilient. So we also are seeing species continue to encroach that we may not want to when we're actively managing these forests. So invasive species like buckthorn, Japanese stiltgrass, barberry. These non-native viburnums have really shown up both in thinned and prescribed fire stands that we're concerned of. And then for the native species, concerns of higher IPS activities as related to secondary invasion due to the active management that we're advancing. So for prescribed fire, our prescribed fire program, we are focusing primarily on landscape scale, trying to look at those areas where they're high hazard and manage across the landscape, not only for the property in mention, but to help mitigate the spread of the species across the areas. We built upon the state's program of looking and prioritizing related to southern pine beetle and the resources available to us for prescribed fire by focusing on fire breaks that were put in and building off of the thinning treatments that were already there. And then I'd also encourage, utilizing those community wildfire protection plans. That'll get you some funding through the federal government to supplement your program, as well as continuing to maintain those areas where recent wildfire occurred, because you've already had the effective natural treatment of those stands and continued the active management of that. Oops. There we go. So here's some pictures of the before and after cut and remove thinning in the woodlands here. And our demonstration forest was burned in June. This is the before treatment. This is the day of after treatment, and then the positive recruitment of vegetation post-fire. So it's been a great opportunity to be able to see the transition of those forests through the demonstration forest. And then we've also put fire on the ground, as I mentioned, in these thinned areas that the state proactively implemented in response to preventative thinning for southern pine beetle over in Sarnoff here, and then we assisted Brookhaven National Lab with their management. And so one of the trends that we're seeing in our post-fire monitoring, our vegetation monitoring and insect monitoring, that we don't have any definitive answers or trends yet, but we are seeing that in stands that were burned this year under high southern pine beetle pressure related to the drought, that we are finding southern pine beetle infesting our prescribed fire treatment areas. So again, as Jess mentioned, we are seeing southern pine beetle potentially responding a little differently to disturbance regimens in the north. And we are continuing to monitor whether or not southern pine beetle is actively infesting, or the disturbance that we're implementing through prescribed fire is attracting southern pine beetle through the stress trees and the turpentines that are released from the pines and attracting southern pine beetle. So one way that we have been able to track this is that we have been flagging the scorched trees and then doing significant surveying to ascertain whether or not southern pine beetle is coming into these stands. So we'll keep abreast of that and relay that information as we know further on what may be occurring. So just to summarize, the considerations for preventative management is critically key, and I can't stress this any more than start management before the beetle arrives. You in the Northeast have that benefit and advantage to knowing that it's coming, and the more that you can do the preventative thinning and prescribed fire management before there's an outbreak, the less southern pine beetle you'll have coming in and causing that damage both in the active managed area as well as creating those high hazard stands. Really consider those drought cycles and southern pine beetle outbreak areas when you're deciding where to stage your management. Utilize cut and remove thinning if you can. So we've been finding with our prescribed fire implementation, it's much easier to do mop up and implementation if you don't have the heavies on the land. And then if you do cut and leave or mastication to stage the burning 6 to 18 months prior to the prescribed fire so that you're getting maximal consumption of that dried material. Keep the flame lengths low to help minimize the scorch and potential damage to those pitch pines that could otherwise attract southern pine beetle. Flag those scorched trees, and then it's really important to conduct that vegetation monitoring and southern pine beetle monitoring post-fire so that you understand what's occurring and can share that information. And then the last thing is when you're developing your burn breaks, we had some burn breaks that were put in where the trees were bulldozed over into the unit, is to make sure that you cut those trees at the base first and then put in the fire break by bulldozing the root masses, and don't leave those trees entire into the burn unit because of the high amount of mop up and saw work that's needed after the fact to reduce both the potential for the spread of the wildfire outside the unit or the prescribed fire outside of the unit, but also risk to your staff safety on the burn. So with that, Nate and I could answer any questions that you have.
I think for the sake of time, we're going to have to move on to the next presentation, but please do feel free to put questions in the chat. And I anticipate having some extra time at the end for those to be addressed.
Great.
Thanks, Polly and Nate, for your presentations. That was great. So moving on to the next section, we're going to look at early detection and monitoring of southern pine beetle. And Kevin Dodds is going to speak to that. He's a forest entomologist with the U.S. Forest Service. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. Let me just get this going. All right. Hopefully you're seeing the presentation now. What I'm going to do today is just talk about some of the southern pine beetle trapping in the Northeast. And, you know, I talked to Jess about this last week or the week before, and we thought maybe this would be a good opportunity to show kind of the methods, because we're getting more and more people involved in trapping who have not ever done detection type trapping before. And so the first part of this, or the majority of the talk, will be methodology, and then I'll show some of some maps have already been shown today, which is good, but highlight some of the recent survey results since 2015 or so. All right. So one of the first things that comes up, when you start thinking about surveying for southern pine beetle is really, what is the objective going to be? And really there's two different ones for southern pine beetle. It's are you going to monitor the population, or are you trying to detect the population? And monitoring, is for areas where you have established populations like on Long Island, and you want to track those populations. the monitoring is really important in the Southeast, where they have the ability to plug in those spring trapping numbers into a predictive model that sort of guides them or gives them some sense of, are we going to be in outbreak levels in certain areas of the Southeast, where, predictive model like that hasn't been tested for us in the Northeast. And I'm not sure, given our landscapes, that it would be something that would be effective or not up here anyways. But detection trapping is really important, and it's been something that we've used since really 2015, 2016 outside of Long Island. Last year we had detections in Maine and New Hampshire. Carolyn Kanaski at UNH trapped some of those beetles, and that really changed the story for us with southern pine beetle right now. We, at least I can speak for myself, I was thinking we had probably 5 or 10 years before we would have to worry about New Hampshire or Maine. And then here we were with at least beetles moving into the area. And so that detection, or those detections, is really important, because that allowed us to start having these discussions like this and the ones we've had in previous presentations with NAFC, really to get people to start thinking about, okay, something's coming your way. It's more immediate threat than we may have thought, and it's time to start really getting into some preventative treatments in your stands. Don't worry about the chemistry here. I was not a very good chemistry student myself, but I needed some nice figures to balance this out. If you're not familiar with trapping and lures, for southern pine beetle, we use a combination of pheromones and host volatiles. Really simple definition of pheromones is a chemical that elicits a response from a conspecific. It all gets much more complicated than that, with a lot of other insects cueing on these chemicals, but I'm not going to get into that today. So for southern pine beetle, we use frontalin, which is that you've heard about aggregation, and that's really driven by frontalin. Endobrevicommin is a really important part of the lure now, but at one point that was even seen as at least a mild antagonist to frontalin and aggregation. But Brian Sullivan in the South has done some work and really tweaked this out and is now demonstrating that endobrevicommin is a bit of a synergist, and I'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute. Host volatiles, we've all smelled them and we're out in a pine forest. These are odors released from trees. They're really associated with stress. So even if the tree's not wounded and and you see resin coming out, those trees are often emitting these stress volatiles as well. And then so for southern pine beetle, it's really a terpene blend of alpha pinene and beta pinene. And these terpenes are really important for a lot of bark beetles because they synergize the aggregation pheromones. So if you just go with the aggregation pheromones out there without those terpenes, you just don't catch nearly as many beetles as you do with the terpenes there. So survey timing, Jess alluded to this, and really a lot of this is changing for us, and that is based off of work by Jess and her group. Others have, Caroline's detections in New Hampshire and Maine. Claire Rutledge in Connecticut trapped, an entire season as well, and we started to see this pattern of a lot of detections occurring late in the season, which is unusual. Spring trapping has been, the traditional trapping period that's used in the Southeast. But again, that's tied into those predictive models, and we're not using those. But, we were taking the tools from the Southeast and using them up here, and now we're learning to modify those some. Fall trapping in the Southeast isn't really used because there's no correlation between late season catches and infestations that following year. But we are again seeing these higher collections in the fall, and so now this will be the first year that some of our other state partners are shifting into fall detections instead of the spring detections. And you can see, on this figure, this is just from Long Island, so it was more of monitoring populations at that point. But a lot of activity, early in the spring, but then traps were brought down probably right when we were about to get another peak, but we didn't know that then. This is some work from Jess and Liam and the group out there, and all of the trapping efforts they've been doing. And it just, I think it's a great figure. I mean, it just really shows a couple things here. One, it's very strange that there is no southern pine beetle detected early at all. Like maybe they weren't in the area yet. And then you get this, something going on in the fall where the traps are really attractive to the beetles. And so hopefully, this all pans out for us and we'll get a bigger or a more complete picture of the distribution in the sort of northern parts of New England this year from everybody's efforts. So, trap types, there really are just two traps that are effective for bark beetles and wood borers like this, at least to catch larger numbers, and the Lindgren funnel trap on the left, and then the panel intercept trap. Really, for a bark beetle only survey like this, there's nothing really better than the Lindgren funnel trap, and going with like a 12-unit funnel trap. If you have panel traps and don't have Lindgren funnel traps, then you can go with that panel trap. It will catch beetles, but my recommendation is always to go with the funnel trap when you can. It's a rugged trap. You'll have it for years, where the panel intercept trap can give you some problems as it ages. If you haven't seen the lures, these are those three components. This is what we would consider the optimal lure for southern pine beetle. This terpene pack, if anybody was involved in Cyrex detections way back, that's the lure that we used for that. It's that 70-30 ratio of alpha and beta pinene. Frontalin is just in some microtubules in this pack here, and there's two of them in there releasing fairly at a high rate. And then endobrevicommin, which looks larger here than it really is, are these little plastic embedded or pheromone embedded plastic that we put in one of those same brown sachets and put that out with these lures. And so this is the optimal lure. I think early on for some of the monitoring, we were leaving out endobrevicommin, but that's added now. Jess has used what would be like a really hot lure in a way where instead of using this mix of 70-30 alpha, they use a more pure form of turpentine. So it's a bunch of other chemicals in there too. And the problem with that and using that everywhere is there's concern that turpentine won't be consistent across years. And so this terpene pack, is mass produced, and they always have the same ratio and the same enantiomeric properties and all that. So it's a consistent lure for year to year. Okay, so trap deployment in the Northeast, when you start thinking about where you're going to trap, how you're going to do this, what you need to do, really, the first question is, where do you want to deploy the traps within a landscape? And there's some things to think about that'll, maybe make this a safer endeavor, especially if you're trapping in areas where there are beetles. It's good to concentrate on oak pine forests or mixed hardwood pine, and pine being hard pine, so pitch pine, red pine, even Scots pine, where there's remnants of that around, those would be good areas to trap. And one of the reasons to focus on those types of forests is if you do start an infestation, which can easily happen, you just don't have the basal area for the infestation to grow into. And that's the reason you want to avoid pure hard pine stands if possible. You don't want to be in a situation, where you initiate an infestation and all of a sudden you've got 50 or 100 trees dead because of where you put your trap. One of the things that I look for a lot, especially, now we have a lot more on federal land anyways, concentrations on wildlife openings and keeping, habitats in early successional stages. And those are great areas to put a trap out with rebar or conduit, even large gaps, within a forest, even a mixed oak pine forest, or depending on, what type of management or suppression has happened in a pure stand, you might have a large enough clearing where you can drop a trap. So then when you start thinking about placement in a stand, I've touched a little bit on this, the first thing, this is I never hang a trap on a pine tree, and some people do that. It's just something that I stay away from because I think you just increase the likelihood of kicking off something if beetles are coming into that area. And you also have the chance of losing, your trap is releasing this pheromone plume. You have it right next to a tree. Well, the tree is a better visual stimuli to the beetle than the trap is. So you could potentially be reducing your effectiveness, your trap effectiveness. And so if you do have southern pine beetle present in the area, you definitely want to stay away from your pines as much as possible. And I try to at least keep 25 meters from host trees. I think going over 30 meters is probably a good idea. And then, when you come back and service those traps every week or every other week, you really want to check around the area and see if you have any infested trees. And that certainly, has been the case in the Northeast. I know in New York, they found a few trees around or close to a trap. And I think that's also the same case now in Massachusetts. So, you want to be pretty conservative when you have southern pine beetle in the area. If you don't think you have southern pine beetle in the area and you're doing those detection surveys, you can be a little bit more liberal with trap placement. But, I still try to just stick to that 25, 30 meter distance. But you can go a little bit closer into pitch pine, maybe pick a stand that's a little bit heavier towards pitch pine component or another hard pine. But again, you want to keep in mind that we don't always know where the beetle is. And so, there is the chance that you could initiate even a small infestation. So in terms of, how we deploy the traps in the field, our lab either uses string. You can't really see it here. The trap's just hovering, but there's a string up on the top there, tied between two trees. You try to keep that trap like 3 meters or so from each tree. I never tie those to, at least with southern pine beetle surveys, to pine trees or even conifers if possible. And then there's the conduit and rebar, and conduit and rebar really give you the most flexibility to walk around a stand and find a good opening away from host trees and just plant the trap kind of where you think it would be optimal. It's amazing how often, you're limited. You're in a forest of trees, but yeah, you can't find a good place that's safe to tie between two trees. I think, my opinion on this is if you're doing detection surveys, then tying between two trees is effective and it's a good method. When you start looking at monitoring or in areas where you think there's a higher likelihood of detecting the insect, you may want to use the conduit and the rebar just to be able to make your trap a little bit more apparent by having it sit outside of other trees or standing out from the background forest. So here's the trap and lure setup, and it's a little weird compared to what we normally do with different detection traps and lure blends and all of that. And so this is from a trap setup on the Massapequa Experimental Forest in southern Maine, an area that, if I'm being honest, I don't think I'll find the beetle, but I don't know. There's a chance it's moving through the area, or at least dispersing through the area. So who knows? So there is pitch pine in this stand, like where I'm behind me, where I'm taking the picture from, are some larger pitch pine, and there's a few sort of dispersed throughout this area. So you can see, the trap's on a string. It's got the terpene pack on it, frontalin on it, and then 4 meters from that, between I think 4 and 6 meters, I usually go out 4 meters, we've got that endobrevicomum. So my understanding, the endobrevicomum, if you move that towards that trap or hang it on the trap, then you start getting that antagonism and your trap catches actually get reduced. So you want that at least 4 meters off. In this case, there was a bent over sapling that was in a perfect place, and I just lashed to that. But we've also used like tomato stakes, where we were in an area that didn't have as many trees or, options for tying it to. And so this is the setup, the whole trap deployed in a place that, we might see the beetle. We definitely wouldn't create an infestation here, which is good. In terms of collections, probably again, a lot of you are familiar with this stuff, but we do use low tox or no tox, non-toxic RV antifreeze. You don't want to put out, typical automobile antifreeze because that kills mammals. And then, when you come and visit your trap, this is what you'll often see, and that's a cup full of a lot of different beetle species. There might be southern pine beetle in there. There probably is not for this collection anyways. And then if, you want to look at those traps every week or two, if you do not, you can often get some nasty things. And even actually sometimes when you do treat your trap, right, you can get a lot of nasty stuff coming into those. And that's a paint filter just full of carrion beetles. It's really only about half of the dead beetles, carrion beetles and filth flies that were in one of our cups. And so these can get pretty nasty to deal with and have to sort through, and especially when you're sorting in a lab with other people, in a building with other people for us. And then, it's not a lot. There's a fair bit of sorting and identification that has to occur. You're going to get a lot of claret beetles, that top picture, the predator that Chris mentioned early on, and they're all over the trees early, and they really respond strongly to the pheromone blend too. And so you'll get a lot of those. You might have southern pine beetle in there, but you get a lot of bycatch that you have to sort through. And it's best to tie in with anybody in your state, forest health groups, or us. You can tie in with our Forest Service as well. We're always willing to help, or at least be able to point anybody to a contact locally. And there is a fair bit of expertise needed to sort these. I think the more you look at them, the more obvious it becomes. But and there are some trainings that occur, every year, pretty much every year now. And so if you're interested, you can reach out to me, and I can put you in contact with people. And then once you have something that you think is southern pine beetle, it's really important to get that species confirmed. And, that can happen at the state level, or it can be sent to us here, and we can look at it. And so, Chris mentioned black turpentine beetle as well. And, this picture on the left just shows some of the common beetles that you'll find in the traps. And those are two species of turpentine beetle at the top, and then southern pine beetle next to that. And then down at the bottom are all the different Ips species, except that last one on the right, which is Orthotomachus. So these are all, common in traps. Ips doesn't respond super strongly to the southern pine beetle lure, but that terpene pack's on there, and that'll bring some in too. So you get a lot of beetles, and they all range in size and overlap and things like that. So it's good to work with somebody that knows this stuff a little bit before you go out on your own. We also, just a couple years ago, put together, a book for bark beetles of northeastern pines, and I'd wanted to do it for a really long time, and Mark DiGirolamo finally pushed it through, and the whole intention of that was to help people that were just really getting into trapping and looking at what was in the cups, to be able to sort of filter out or identify, the easier species, and then, seek help on anything else. So if anybody's interested in that, I can't link to it right now because the Forest Service websites are a mess right now. But if anybody wants it, just shoot me an email and I'll send it out, or I'll figure a way to get it around to everybody else. Okay, so just really quickly, the keys to a successful survey, you want to be in or near that hard pine habitat. I think this becomes more and more important as we move north, and it looks like southern pine beetle is able to locate these somewhat isolated hard pine stands on a landscape. So that's interesting, and it's helpful to target. You really want to maintain those traps, and that includes the lures. And, normally I used to think of 6 weeks as no problem in late season trapping, that your lure would make it all the way through. But we were out at some of ours 2 weeks ago. I think they had been out 4 weeks at that point, and they were just, the terpene pack was almost fried because we had a lot of over 90-degree weather through that, August and even at the beginning of September. And then, you don't want to start an infestation. This picture does not represent an infestation started by trapping, but it is something that can happen. I've never done it with southern pine beetle, but I have done it with Douglas fir beetle. And, I had traps out in a clearing probably 75, maybe 100 meters from a forest edge, and that the lure is pushed over there, and that's where beetles started attacking trees. So it's something that really can happen, and you want to be careful of, especially if you have southern pine beetle in the area. I just wanted to finish by, showing the survey results. These, I think probably most people here were on the previous NAFC calls that we had and meetings, and these have been shown there. But just to give you, just to summarize where we're at, again, I think is a good idea. So this was our footprint for a really long time. This was 2015, 2016. There was trapping led by our state partners after that too, but we just didn't really add to this map. And so, just seemed Long Island, Connecticut, maybe the Cape were areas that were sure to, in Rhode Island, we're sure to have infestations at some point here. But nothing really changed for a while. And one part of that, I think, too, is, we were trapping in the spring only for all of this, for the most part anyways. But, last year, I mentioned Caroline's work and her detections in Dodds Pine Barrens and Waterboro Pine Barrens. Jess and her group also had traps out late and detected some infestations, or I'm sorry, had positive trap catches further north. And then also, in their case, just a lot more beetles than had been previously seen in traps. So this is the footprint as we know it now. It's going to be interesting to see, what happens over the next couple of weeks, because New Hampshire has traps out. Tom Schmelk is trapping in the fall in Maine, and so there'll be some more information from those traps, as well as filling in some of these other areas. So it's a kind of an exciting time. I mean, hopefully those, the New Hampshire and the Waterboro Maine sites where, we won't see any more catches there for a few years, but we'll have to wait and see. So I think that's everything I have. Yeah, so if you have any questions, you can reach out to me or to Jess at any time after this.
Thanks, Kevin. So we're gonna cut into our break a little bit. I'll give 5 minutes now for questions for either Nate, Polly, or Kevin. For Polly, could SPB and new RX fire sites be a function of the forest management legacy? How does SPB behave with fire in natural stands down south? Are the weak trees after fire the ones that beetles would have infested when they were in balance with native stands in healthy pine systems? We'll start with those. He's got a few other questions, but if you want to address any of those, any of the speakers can speak up.
Sure. I'm just trying to go back to it. So
There's a few questions there.
I mean, I'll just talk in general terms about southern pine beetle on fire and kind of what we're seeing. So, and I don't know if Kathy's on but Polly's here and others can chime in, but as odd as it is, southern pine beetle is not known to go towards stressed trees, right? So you wouldn't really expect a scorched tree that is stressed to necessarily attract southern pine beetle. I know that sounds counterintuitive, but we're certainly starting to see this pattern that, after these prescribed fires, they're spring, I think, right? They've all been, at least the ones in the demo forest have been spring fires, and then late in the fall, maybe I think Sabrina and Sam found some attack trees earlier in the summer, but they're all then getting filled in or hit. Some portion of those trees, a very small portion of those trees, are getting attacked by southern pine beetle later in the fall, where normally those beetles would be looking for like an overwintering host at that point, but we see infestations continue to grow. So I don't know. I mean, I all of the literature says they aren't attracted to stressed trees, but it sure seems like, some of those trees were scorched pretty bad. They were on the edge, at least in one of our demo forests. And you look at it and it's hard to believe that they wouldn't have been attracted to that. It's out there releasing, those stress terpenes and all that. But we need to, we really need to do a lot more work on that. In the southeast, they see similar things where some trees are attacked, but it's not considered common. And I don't know if we have anybody like John or anybody on from the southeast, but they'll thin, right. Even there's been situations where they've thinned during an infestation just to try to knock down areas. And then so I think that fire isn't necessarily viewed as a predisposing factor for beetles down there.
So I'll add, Kevin, that Kathy found SPB in the burn unit on BNL that we burned in July, but she didn't find it in the forest treatments with prescribed fire she did in 2017. So one of the things that, one of the hypothesis question marks that we have is when the 2017 prescribed fire was conducted, we weren't as an outbreak area, and southern pine beetle is in heavy outbreak in BNL. So whether burning that forest in a knowingly outbreak stage at southern pine beetle in close proximity then helped facilitate outbreak in the treated stand.
And then I saw the last part of Neil's question, which is a great question. What was going on before all of this? And, in the South, the kind of one model of how they persist over the winter is in lightning struck trees. And they were sort of these refugia during, non-outbreak years. And I don't really know what's going on up here, because this factors into sort of where we detect these at really low levels, right? Like what kind of trees are they surviving in? Are they wounded trees? Some other bark beetles strip kill. So just one portion of the tree. Southern pine beetle is not really known for that, but we also feel like we've seen a little bit of evidence for that. So it's hard to say right now. My guess is that, yeah, those trees are attracting them in, whether they're burned or stressed from something else, and they're just subsisting at low levels below like a detectable threshold for us for anybody doing aerial survey or anything like that. There's no spot forming, and so one or two dead trees on the landscape isn't much of a signal for somebody to pick up on.
Kevin, Leon Dalva asked, when does the fall hatch or emergence begin, and what time should one apply verbenone?
Yeah, I wouldn't. I'm not in a place that I would recommend verbenone, and there is no necessarily fall hatch. Remember, these are, I think Sabrina mentioned this during her talk, these are overlapping generations. So once things get going, you have beetles attacking trees, through the summer. I mean, it feels to me anyways on Long Island that things get going a little bit later, but I defer to the folks that are down there every day dealing with this. And really, when I feel like a lot of the work that I do when I'm down there is in the fall, and there's still a lot of attacked trees happening. So, August, September, October, I've seen beetles in December going into trees, which is crazy to think about, but that's what was happening. But it's also important to keep in mind, the last 4 or 5 years and fall temperatures have been super mild in the Northeast too. So I wouldn't worry about verbenone right now. If you want to protect a tree and it's a landscape tree, and it's legal to do, you probably want to think about pesticides on that in that situation. I see Lisa's question. Let's see. So if trapping is more successful in the fall in the Northeast, should the trapping be full season or just in the fall? That's a great question. I don't know. I look at the stuff that Jess has been doing and not getting a lot of activity in traps early on, and then getting traps, getting collections in the fall. Caroline's data from, Waterboro and Ossipee was the same way. She didn't have a single southern pine beetle in those traps until late in the fall. So, it's a lot more resources to have to deal with to run trapping all season. I think right now, there's enough suggested evidence that we can start focusing a little bit more on the fall, and we're going to be we have an STDP grant with University of Georgia and the Southern Research Station to look at some of these questions up here. But if I had to, if I had a 5 or 6 week window to trap and that was it, that's the resources I had, I would go with the fall trapping now over the spring trapping for detection.
She continued to ask, could she do 6 weeks spring and 6 weeks fall?
No, and I was going to recommend that too. I mean, we've talked about that. That's how we're going to do our experiment, actually, is run some in the spring, shut them down, and then run stuff in the fall too. So, I think, Lisa, you're in a unique situation because you're probably one of the only people that's consistently surveyed, right? Like with the same lab doing the same areas. And so, that's something to think about too, that you have that sort of long-term-ish data set that you may not want to break up. But if you did 6 weeks early, 6 weeks late, that's probably still consistent with even trapping the whole summer because you're not getting a lot in the middle.
And then if there's time for one more question. So there's a question, is there a population explosion of our native pine beetles? So I can answer that a little bit. Nate might be able to further answer, but we have seen increases in turpentine beetle activity on Long Island. And as Chris mentioned, they are native, and when they do kill the trees, they're killing 1 or 2 trees rather than having a mass outbreak. So that's part of their general activity in the forest. It's not necessarily a negative. It opens up the gaps, continues that individual insect population, but there is an increase in turpentine activity that you may see.
Yeah, and we were always worried about Ips beetles too. They respond, especially when you start dropping a lot of trees for either suppression or thinnings where you have to leave the wood down, and that's an issue in the southeast where these Ips beetles will build up in that and then spill into living trees. But we've just seen really no evidence of that whatsoever. So that the Ips beetles, they may build up locally, but they're not doing any damage.
Rob and Nate are going to talk again. This time they're going to cover monitoring and response of southern pine beetle. Rob will cover the incident command system, and Nate will cover surveying and ground truthing techniques as well as suppression.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Once again, yeah, I'm Rob Cole. Hopefully you're here all morning and are enjoying yourself. So I'm going to talk quickly about establishing incident command for SPB management, and then Nate's going to take it away after that. One thing that we've heard a little bit about is the rate of which SPB moves and how fast it, once you find it, it can spread quickly, multiple generations, and then you can see, kind of the damage that's done if you don't get right on it. So it's not a pest that you have luxury of kind of slowly putting together a team and figuring out what's what and building up over several years. You really need to be able to jump right on it. So when we started, there were a lot of people that we thought should be involved, a lot of people who thought that they should be involved. So there was a lot of sorting out the players and, the not players, who's here in a support role, who has the ability to help with funding, who has the ability to help with staff, equipment, et cetera, like that. So we thought, incident command's really going to help with this. It helps sort people out and figure out roles and responsibilities and things like that. And so, if you're going to be part of the incident command system, there's some simple things, that help you figure out what your role is. Do you have jurisdiction over the area that's being attacked by SPB, or do you have the authority? Is it in your authority to work on invasive species, or do you have funding to get this work done? I mean, if you're one or more of those things, you're a major player in this. And that's who needs to be at the table. So we took all of these partners, and there's a lot of folks on Long Island, our original list of people who were part of the team was, probably 100 people long at least, with all the way from the federal level with Brookhaven and Wertheim down to, the local towns that are part of the Pine Barrens Commission. So ICS really helps sort that out because you establish that criteria early on, about authority and jurisdiction and funding, and then you kind of go from there. The other thing it helps with is communication issues and communication breakdowns. Again, this is a fast-moving pest. You don't have time to not know who to talk to, when to talk to, how to get your survey data to the people with the chainsaws so they know where to go cut trees. So communication breakdown is a great thing if you're Led Zeppelin. It's bad if you're managing a southern pine beetle program, because your program will crash and burn. With southern pine beetle, we set up an incident command structure with an incident commander all the way at the top, and then all the way down through the various operations that we had going on in the field. We had a planning section, and then logistics and finance. And some people get scared by this, scared off. It looks very, hierarchy. There's somebody who's, the incident commander, and they're, some high up, tough position to be in. But that's not really what it's about. It's so that the flow of information is known. You know who you report to, who reports to you, what information people above you need, what information people below you need, kind of in this organization chart, so you can really move efficiently during your planning process and out in the field, because you're not calling 20 people trying to figure out the right person who you need to talk to get something from or to give something to. So this was at one point our setup here. You can see we had a lot going on in operations. We tried to divide that up by expertise. We got different folks involved, but this was mainly DEC because we realized, for us at least, we had the ability to work on multiple ownerships. We had funding and we had staff. So we kind of took the lead on a lot of this work on state land and county lands and some town land. So we're talking about communication. So this is an ICS form. It's already pre-developed. You can go right online and download it. And this puts everybody in a box, so you can see who the incident commander is, who, all the way down through all those command staff positions, who are the agency representatives. So there's a lot of people that need to be in the loop, know what's going on, but they may not have a direct impact on your exact operation. So again, this is about communication. Nobody can say, I didn't know who was in this position, and so I didn't know who to call. You know my name, you can look up the number. The Beatles let us know that. So that puts all this information in a really handy place. The other thing that we benefit from is this planning P. So you're going to be really busy. There's a lot going on. Unfortunately, time is not on your side if you have a big southern pine beetle outbreak going on. So ICS helped us a lot with our planning and having meetings. So you may not have a lot of people involved and you're saying, well, I don't need a separate tactics meeting because it's the same people in the planning meeting, but they still give you agendas and structures to work from, so that you're covering all your bases and you're putting together a good plan, a good operational plan for what you want to do out in the field. So as part of your incident action plan, you're going to have some of these forms that I've showed you and some that are coming up. But what you focus on here with your incident action plan is it really focuses you down on what you want to get done and forces you to put that down on paper, which I find really useful, because you can kind of talk about things and maybe say, oh, this could be a good idea, maybe we should do that. And then, people aren't sure and it gets wishy-washy. When you put it down on the form and you hand it out, email it around, you can see exactly what everyone is expected to do, when they're expected to do it, and where they're expected to do it. And then this provides for a lot of clarity. especially when you have a lot of staff. We've had large field crews, and we've had field crews basically on Long Island every year since we found this in some capacity or another, cutting trees, surveying, whatever it might be. So you can see on this form, it lays out, just some command emphasis. Again, things like command emphasis sound scary, but that's just, what are we trying to accomplish? What are the overall goals? And then another thing I like about this is it does, it shows you other things that could be in your plan or should be in your plan, safety plan. You can see this one includes closest hospitals, which I also appreciate when we're planning that we're taking into consideration some of these safety aspects. Oftentimes when we're out there, we're focused on surveying or whatever it might be, southern pine beetle, and nobody's really thought about, well, what if somebody gets hurt while we're out here? Our operations are fairly large and have a lot of people and a lot of equipment involved. So we take the time to identify emergency locations and protocols for that. Now, I think the last thing here that I'm going to bring up is, we saw that ICS form where we put our objectives and what we wanted to accomplish. The other great thing about the incident command system is they have forms where you can report out on what you did. So you'll see this one on the left is kind of a standard one that you get from FEMA or other federal agencies that are running large emergency situations. So their incident status summary form has things on it like fatalities, injuries, missing people, sheltering in place, etc. So you don't have to use their exact form. What you can see is we did here on the right. We took all the information, but we tailored it specifically to the things we would want to track over an operational period. So you can go online and download all the incident command forms, and you can get, I think, all of them in Word document form, and then you can go in and edit them so that they meet your specific needs. We don't need to know about, people who are in need of rescue or mass notifications or shelter in place progress, things like that. What we need to know is how much aerial survey was completed, where it was completed, how much spot suppression was completed, and where it was completed, how long it took, things like that. And so you can see the ICS system really has helped us here, really, so we know what happened in the time period that the plan was for, and you can see at the bottom the annual objective totals. So this report reflects the same 1 week period that the plan was for that I showed you a couple slides before. So you really have that, we plan to do this, we accomplished this, and then it's really easy to see if you're meeting long-term goals, where your resources are going, how much money you're spending, and really a lot of great information can be incorporated in. And so that's kind of how we use the system here in New York. And now I'll pass it over to Nate.
Hi, Rob. I raised my hand because I have a question. Do you think that, especially that organizational chart where people decide, just write down who the players are, who they work for, different municipal stuff. Do you think that's something that somebody could do ahead of time before the southern pine beetle comes?
You know what? That's a great question, Nate. I appreciate you asking that. Yes. One, with ICS, there are trainings available. There are free trainings online through FEMA. You can get a basic understanding of the system and find all the forms there. And then, yeah, if southern pine beetle could threaten your forest, it would be great to try to identify these players. Like I said, when we found it, it had to be at least 100 people that we had to kind of figure out who was who and what they could do. So, yep, great question, Nate.
Yeah, awesome. All right, so I'm going to go into my portion, which is about aerial survey and ground survey. Some of this is going to have been covered already. Aerial to on the ground. All right. There we go. All right, so southern pine beetle response from aerial survey, ground survey to suppression. All right, moving forward. So these are just our loose management goals that I kind of always keep in my head at all times. When it comes to southern pine beetle, I don't think they're not controversial. You know, kind of have four things here. You have control of southern pine beetle, that is monitoring for it and suppressing it, then protecting rare and susceptible ecosystems, restoring the SPB impacted areas, and then increasing forest health and resilience with the things I talked about previously with thinning and fire and that. So this presentation is about that SPB control, monitoring and suppression, not trapping, monitoring. So we kind of jumping right in there. You have aerial surveys. We use a fixed wing, mostly aircraft. This is our preferred aircraft down here. That's a Partnavia light surveyor. Sometimes we have to do it in an older, bumpier, less good Cessna, but that's a picture from one of our surveys this summer. We also sometimes, especially with the help of our drone pilot with the commission, Polly, have been getting out there and doing drone surveys and then ground surveys. So in an ideal situation, we'll get out there with the fixed wing and we'll fly grids across the entirety of the Pine Barrens and out to Long Island, identify areas of where SPB may be occurring, looking for those stage 2 and 3s, which are visible. Then what we've been doing this year, which is pretty slick, is Polly has flown them with the drone to kind of really focus our ground survey crews, and then we get out there and ground survey, which is just boots on the ground, creating a plan and going out there and grading an entire park, 1,000 acres, crawling through the catbrier. So this is a picture from one of our aerial surveys. This is a fairly large infestation. This is a few years old now. It's out near Quag. And you can see how it's moving, and west is on towards the sand mine and east is the other way. You can see how this is moving east, different directions, and it's kind of being slowed up by that field. So we'll fly and we'll just on a tablet, this tablet, identify polygons or areas where SPB is, where we're seeing this crown discoloration. And while we're up there, we do other DCAs, damage causal agents. So we're looking for other things as well, but our flights are mostly SPB. Another picture of the Connecticut aftermath. As you know, this state park lost 95% of its pine now. So we produce these aerial polygons. We try to color code them from red to green, red being the most severe, above 50% mortality, and green being 1 and 2% mortality. We get that data to our ground survey crews. They get out there and find them and flag the trees, and then they produce this ground survey map. So in 2020, that was the only year where we weren't able to have any significant suppression effort during the summer for a whole host of reasons. But we were able to get out and we were able to do some ground surveying, and this is some work Chris did. We did a flight that winter, and we discovered an infestation here at this Great Hill property complex. And we got out there and surveyed it in the early spring, and then midsummer, early summer, midsummer, late winter. And over the course of that summer, I think this was, a few hundred acres. Over the course of that summer, effectively that entire, what was a public use area, lost its pine component in that single year. This is sort of an example of what happens when we don't do suppression. We weren't able to suppress that year, and that expansion was very rapid. the earlier we can suppress in the year, the more effective you are. We have some issues with the long-eared bat window in the month of June and July, but we have workarounds for that. So then suppression is getting out there and cutting them down, getting a crew, getting that communication. The ICS system is kind of key for this, because while this is a picture of our crews, our DEC crew from a few years ago, you may have multiple crews working. You might have like with us, a Sawyer crew from the commission, our own crew, and a general contractor, all working, all doing suppression at the same time, and coordinating that with the ground survey efforts. I can't stress the ICS system enough for that communication. And with suppression, especially midsummer suppression, this is a dynamic and active infestation. So you're hitting a moving target. And this isn't, I have a lot of experience working with EAB and other forest insects. They don't typically move within the same year or expand that much. It's one expansion and then, each year. With SPB, the expansion, at least what we've been seeing on Long Island, is just, that 4 to 8 week window, typically, maybe as far as 10 weeks, but that really means that if you're going to get out there and do suppression, you have to be out there within 2 weeks. And that when crews get out to a suppression site, resurvey that site, take a minute, walk the boundaries of it. Has it moved? Are there new pitch tubes, new infested trees further out behind what was flagged by the surveyors? If they are, resurvey, flag, update your data, and cut the larger polygon now, the larger amount of trees, because you are hitting that moving target. And this is key when we're using a contractor, that we have to be right out there with a rapid, just before the contractor is out there, survey it, get the work to them, so that then they can be out there within that 2 to 4 week window before the beetle has expanded. Especially what we're seeing is like end of August through the month of September to right into October is extreme rapid expansion. And that's what we're seeing this year. And again, when we do suppression, just to reiterate, we divide these up into the 3 stages: stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. And I'm bringing this back up because we only do suppression on stage 1 and stage 2 trees. Stage 1 are those fresh attack trees that have beetles going in and have just started to do their beetle business and maybe lay some eggs, maybe have some young brood in them. And then stage 2, you have later stage brood, pupating into adults, and about ready to emerge. The most effective tree to suppress is that stage 1 and then the buffer tree, which is an uninfested tree directly on the outside of the infestation. So because those stage 1s have that most active infestation, and I'll go back, because they have the most active infestation and those beetles are entering that tree, those are the ones you really want to get out. And again, we're looking for pitch tubes, and we're looking for, especially on those early infested trees, or like this year with a drought year, you might not get pitch tube development. Like, it was significant how many trees didn't, or how small the pitch tubes were this year. There's just no water for the trees to produce pitch. So then you're looking for that frass with some pitch tubes. And the stage 1s are more effective to cut because they have that live active brood. By the time you get to a stage 2, you have a lot of brood and late stage larvas that are going to develop and probably emerge from that tree. So putting that tree on the ground where we do cut and leave suppression, you're still going to have brood emerging from a stage 2. And stage 3, that's a dead tree, that's evacuated. The only reason to cut that down is if it's a hazard for human safety. So this is spot suppression. You have the dead trees, you identify the active infestation trees, we flag them with we flag the active infested trees with orange. And then when we survey a buffer around the active infestation that then we survey with red. And we do that so that then when the sawyers go out there and they see a buffer tree that was flagged with red and it has pitch tubes in it, they know that that is expanded by using the two colors with infested trees versus buffer trees. And that knows, they should be looking even further out past the buffer. So this is a typical spot suppression. We do cut and leave. Cut and remove is a much better option, but since we don't have it on Long Island, we do cut and leave. So you have a typical, mixed 50-50 pine, oak, Long Island pine barren, and the pine all end up getting infested, and then you cut them down and you end up with this, what is effectively an oak release, but all the pine cut and a lot of slash developed. And I draw that because I want to have these two comparison sites. On the left, we have a suppressed site, and on the right, we have an unsuppressed site. The end result is going to be the same. The trees are going to die, and they're going to fall down. And on the right here, this is actually a really highly used trail taken from the trail that they've actually had to close and have some a contractor come in and remove the hazards. So actually you're looking where the contractor has moved all the hazards, a certain distance away from the trail where the picture was taken. But the end result is the trees are going to die and they're going to fall. And if we can get out there and suppress them, we can hopefully, like in the suppression picture, there's actually a forest in the background. Whereas in the unsuppressed, there isn't. There's no more pine component to that property. So this is a graphic we made a few years ago. Molly Hassett made, and this was a prop on the left. Again, we have an unsuppressed area that we weren't able to work on that property, so we weren't able to get in there and do suppression. So from December 2014 to January 2016, which is a year, even though it's a 2-year gap, it's only a 13-month period. The unsuppressed area grew 10 times as much. We're over here on Henry's Hollow, DEC property, we were able to work extensively. Very little expansion. And this is getting a little bit dated, but the graphic's nice, so I still present it. Still in Henry's Hollow, we survey it every year. We work there every year. We cut out a few trees, but in essence, that core infestation from 2014 to 2016 that was cut, that's basically still where we're at. Some pockets here and there have been removed, but there's still a large amount, there's a large continuous pine forest there still. Whereas just a few miles away in East Quogue, that property is denuded of pine. There is no more pine component there, and it's transitioning to coastal oak and invasive species. So suppression really has an effect, especially when you can get out there and get after it in that brief time period, 2-3 weeks after ground surveying. So if you have any questions for me or Rob or anyone else, I'd like to hear them.
Oh, he said, great presentation. We had the same assumptions about smoke and smoldering and scrub oak mastication. However, we have consistently found that unless KBDI is too high, ground season fire and a scrub oak mastication actually reduces smoke and smoldering issues. So the slash produces a slow-moving hot fire that generates enough heat to push the smoke up and away. It is also hot enough to consume litter and duff, eliminating most smoldering and commensurate nuisance smoke.
Even I would just generally say that we've not been able to burn with higher KBDIs to take advantage of that. We've been prescribing in the southern pine, in the central pine barrens, we've been prescribing KBDIs higher than have normally been. And we're doing that for a couple of reasons. One is to try to achieve some fire going into the organic mat that Polly was talking about. And I just find that, yeah, under less windy, but little drier conditions, when things are in alignment and you have a slow moving fire through it, you get a lot of consumption, you get a lot of good lift on smoke. It's
I think that's really our goal, is to have that slower burning fire that's able to consume more of that organic matter. In the scrub oak where you're masticating it, that's ideal. But when we're talking about larger volumes of southern pine beetle impacted organic matter, woodies on the ground, that's where it becomes more challenging to balance having some of those heavier woodies partially consumed and then the tie-in with mop-up time.
one of your big things that you always got to look at on all this. Oh, okay. When these mastications occur, we have to look at wildland fuels in the way that they're in their arrangement and their continuity. So when you have a scrub oaks 14 feet tall underneath pitch pine, you have great horizontal and vertical arrangements of the oaks. And when you go in there and masticate that out, and now you've got an open stand with all this masticated material underneath you, you can look at it and say, oh my gosh, this is really changing. This will be a simple fire. The bottom line is that even though you've done this mastication, that excessive fuel volume has not gone away. So it's still there. So you're going to get a real hot fire in an area that you might not expect to have that hot a fire, because you've got what should have been 4 tons per acre of fuel volume in this forested area. And now you've suddenly got 7.5 tons per acre, almost twice the volume. So, and then it might take multiple treatments to get through there and consume that stuff. So coming back 2 years later on a prescribed burn in the same area would probably help reduce some of that fuel volume too.
Yeah, and I think that retreatment of some of those areas with mastication is going to be necessary.
Yeah, definitely. If you're not able to get back into there, if you're not able to get back in to put fire on the ground in a timely fashion of mastication, and you have significant scrub oak regrowth, which we've seen, then you may need to masticate it and plan or budget to masticate in advanced timing of that prescribed fire operation.
And then in many ways, right after a mastication, you don't have continuous enough fuels to put a burn in. You actually need a year, at least a year, to where you have the ability for a fire to carry across it. All
right, thanks for those answers and questions. I'm going to call it on questions for now, and we'll move on to John Wernet's presentation, our final presentation on funding resources. He's going to be focusing on private lands. We intended to have someone talk about public land funding opportunities as well, but there may be a follow-up with that as well. We won't be including that in this presentation. So welcome John Wernet. He's a forester with DEC, Division of Lands and Forests here in Region 1 on Long Island.
All right, it's the end of the day, so I'll keep it short and sweet. And all right, so funding potential. Good luck with it. We've been dealing with southern pine beetle since 2014 and been blessed with our federal partners and some state funding from the Environmental Protection Fund. So very lucky. Sources is really Google's your friend. There's some local sources if you're lucky enough. We've actually lucked out, had some volunteers just volunteering their time, which is great. I wish I could pay them, but it's nice enough to have that. And then state, federal, and then don't forget about your not-for-profits, your non-government organizations as well. And sorry about that. Local, good luck. Like I said, biggest thing is, you can luck out. We've had Team Rubicon, which is a fantastic group. It's actually veterans that need the saw time to practice for storm response, but essentially looking out to your local community. I've had some Boy Scouts help out on their Eagle projects, community groups in general, but really just try to get a local buy-in. You'd be surprised that people, really like to help out. It's, it's their woods and they like to maintain it just as well as you do. As far as state goes, it depends on what state you're in. New York, we're lucky. We have, urban forestry grants, which municipalities can apply for, non-for-profits and such. And it really pertains more to the suburban landscape, but we actually have had, namely Sisters of St. Joseph and Brentwood have lucked out and gotten quote unquote urban forestry grants from DEC to replant some areas affected by southern pine beetle. And we're lucky that we now have a Regeneration New York grant as well. And that's a relatively new program. And then also there's a forest tax law program. If you own more than 50 acres, you can subscribe to it. It's about sustainable land management, but you have to work with a forester. But it more pertains, you have to work with your state. Each state is different, but most states have that forest tax law program. The Southern Pine Beetle federal program has state assistance in the South. So unfortunately for New York, I don't know. I believe New Jersey had a program. I don't know if it's still going on, but these states do. So if you're in these states, I would reach out to the local forest health program and they will help you with any funding they have available. Like I said, federal, reach out to the Forest Service. They've been fantastic in assisting us with landscape level grants. The demonstration forest was really the impetus and helped us kick off this whole program. And reach out to them. There's always stuff going on with the Forest Service. And I borrow this from the National Association of State Foresters. They're a great group of all the state foresters, and they really advocate for all these programs. You can see, numerous programs for stewardship, state and volunteer fire capacity, but that's on the more national level. And since, you can read that 2004, over $100 million has been provided with this huge problem. And like I said, work with your federal partners. Also to mention, you have obviously USDA Forest Service, but Natural Resource Conservation Service, and it's called EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentives Program. We don't have any on Long Island, but I know it's a larger program upstate, but reach out to your local NRCS for that office. And I just, like I said, did a quick Google and look for, nationalforests.org is a great group, U.S. Endowment for Forests, Future Forests. There's so many programs, and really just get out and apply for as much as you can. And that's really about it. As far as the funding goes, good luck.
I would just add, John, that there is an NRCS office in Riverhead. I don't know that when John referenced not any on Long Island, I don't believe there's been anyone on Long Island that's taken advantage of the EQIP funding for forestry management in public. But Liz Camps is the district conservationist in Riverhead, 727-2315. She can be reached if you need assistance and are interested in getting funding through that program.
Thanks, Polly.
I'll just add a few things to on the federal side. I was hoping to have somebody available to talk today about, there's just what appears to be a ton of money coming down regarding, fire prevention, healthy forests, things like that. I'm in no position to talk about it. I was trying to take notes when I was talking to somebody who was really involved in it. We couldn't get anybody for this date to speak, just because this is a tough time for them. But I am working with Virginia and Amanda with NAFC to try to get together a talk for, it'll probably be like a 1 hour or so webinar in November, where we'll have somebody, or it's going to be a couple people, just kind of provide an overview of all of these different avenues of like restoration type money that it's becoming available over the next couple years. So there'll be some opportunities that, you know, like that John never had when he was trying to get some of this done, and other folks haven't had before. I think it's going to be, I hope it's a windfall for a lot of people thinking about restoration treatments in pitch pine. So stay tuned, and we'll send an announcement out at some point once we lock everything down.
Thanks, Kevin.
Sure.
And I want to thank Amanda and Virginia too for continuing to coordinate workshops regarding southern pine beetle management and pitch pine. They've done some really great work, and we're happy to work with them as well.
My chat's disabled, so I'm just unmuting to say our pleasure.
Thank you, Virginia. Direct message. He said he would like to hear comments from the panel on SPB long distance migration, and also hosts attacked, like alternate hosts, including eastern white pines or Norway spruce.
Yeah, so long distance migration, that's a good question. There's not a ton known. I mean, it can, so that spring dispersal is where it's really trying to put distance between, you know, emergence and where a new infestation will start. And I don't remember the numbers specifically, but I want to say that, you know, 90% of those emergent beetles go like, you know, 1 or 2 kilometers. But there is longer distance dispersal to wind dated. You know, some of those beetles can get pushed pretty far, and bark beetles in general, especially some of the Dendroctonus species, they can go really far. I mean, Douglas fir beetle has been, you know, on a flight mill where it just goes in circles. It's like 15 kilometers in a flight. So there's nothing like super limiting to southern pine beetle dispersal in the spring. You know, like if it gets up above tree line and it's windy out, those beetles are going to get carried a pretty far distance. Can't be any more, I mean, that's really vague, a pretty far distance, but I don't have the numbers at hand to think about that. But a kilometer flight is pretty easily, you know, and then that's just one flight. It could sit and then fly further. What was it? Other conifer hosts. Yeah, you know, white pine, we see it attacked. Everybody on here, probably from Long Island, has seen some of the white pine down there. And anybody can chime in. You know, my feeling on it is it's just not a good host. You know, we see it attacked. You know, Nate took me into a stand 2 or 3 years ago now that with all the pitch pine were hammered. The white pine looked terrible and they were attacked really hard, but there really weren't any galleries in there. There was hardly any successful brood. There were parent galleries. A lot of them were, you know, had resin all through them, and so they were not successful. We took samples from there, and you know, there's just the brood just didn't seem to develop. It can develop in white pine, and there's been infestations. Well, I know of a single infestation in the southeast that's talked about a lot, and I think it was North Carolina, where, you know, the story is that white pine maintained an infestation, meaning that, you know, it successfully reproduced in that white pine and then started another generation in other trees, but there's no hard data on that. So I look at it as a tree that, you know, it's going to get hit here and there, but it's not producing a lot of beetles right now. And probably, you know, some parts of those trees that we looked at may have produced beetles, but we saw no evidence of it on any of the logs that we took and dissected. Norway spruce, I think you've seen it, Dan, in Norway spruce. There was a report of a stand in Connecticut of Norway spruce that got attacked by southern pine beetle, but I never was down, you know, in those stands, so I don't have a good feel for, you know, how successful it was in that. But it is, you know, Norway spruce has been recorded as a host before, as has hemlock, I think, too.
I think what we're seeing really is that pitch pine is supporting the reproduction, and when you get a really hot spot of southern pine beetle and an outbreak, they're hungry, and so they're going into whatever suitable host species they could find, whether it's Norway spruce or white pine, and they will kill it. But I think it's advantageous that we're not seeing it really be able to successfully reproduce. We'll also see it infest smaller pines, less than 3 inches in diameter, when you're in those active hotspots as well. So those are some of the unusual things that we see in behavior when there's a significant hotspot in an outbreak.
That's very true, Polly. I think in terms of non-traditional host species, so not hard pines, white pine, or any of the other conifers, it's all about proximity to a major infestation. Out in East Hampton, where we've seen a lot of white pine infested, it's basically a mixed 50-50 pitch pine stand. So, and while some of the white pine has died, some of the white pine have been hit hard. They produce pitch tubes and they survive. And you go out there right now and there's just scarring over of where the pitch tubes were, and the tree just handled it. So I think in terms of non-hard pines, it's all about proximity to that major infestation and not the beetle population. I think, like what Polly was saying, when they're going into 2-inch diameter trees, you're at such a high SPB population, they're probably going into the oaks too. You just can't see it. I mean, they're just hungry. There's no space available. There's no vacancies at any of the pine hotels, and they are trying everything. They'll land on you.
I think one of the other interesting responses that we're seeing, and we'll hopefully pick this up in our vegetation monitoring, is that if there are white pines nearby a southern pine beetle or pitch pine affected stand, that we're not getting the recruitment of pitch pine, we're getting the recruitment of white pine. It further shows the need for prescribed fire and the trends towards mesification.
Yeah.
Great.
So we just got a question coming in about so suppression when there's a drought. Are infestations more aggressive, and should we make buffers bigger because of that? Yes. Infestations seem to be more aggressive during a drought. Have no data. I'm an operations person. But they seem to be more aggressive. I think there's a combination of things. Droughts tend to be hotter. They tend to, which the beetles have a faster life cycle. So they tend to have more generations in a year with a hot, dry drought, like this year exactly. And they tend to not produce the pitch tubes. So having a bigger buffer in a drought year is something we do. And I don't think I actually mentioned our protocol for buffers. It's a little different, and it's a flexible buffer based on the size of the infestation. So we do 10 feet of crown distance. So not trunk distance, crown distance, where the branches are overlapping, per 0.1 acre of infestation, not to exceed 50 feet, which is actually a small buffer compared to what they do down south. But on Long Island, we don't have the property sizes to go out 200 feet. So we cap it at 50, because if you have a half acre infestation at 10 feet per 0.1 acre of infestation, that is your 50-foot buffer. And that is a lot of buffer. You're probably cutting more trees in buffer than are in the polygon. And we've had good success because we go back. It's not you suppress and then you forget about it for the year. You suppress in June, July, August, and September, the same location. So you might cut out, 100 trees, then 10 trees, then 1 or 2 trees at the same location in the course of the year. When we have those, when we have had the resources and had the larger crews. I don't know if we ever came back 4 times, but we definitely have come back to the same location 3 times in a year and done suppression.
We've also moved to flagging the infested trees with orange flagging, and then the buffer trees with red. So when you do come back, you can tell where the spread has occurred, and if you need to expand that buffer.
that was a big nuance that really, really helped us, because we were just flagging all with orange. And then when it was actually Bob Slocum, I think, his idea, we started doing that. And it was just like, oh, wow, now you can see when it moves. Where there are pitch tubes here, they're orange. And then the red one, that must have been a buffer. So if there's a pitch tube in it, it's moved. When was it surveyed? Wow, 2 weeks ago. It's already moved out to that next row of trees in 2 weeks. So getting people who know what they're doing is important too. And I don't think there's any other way to do it than to do it. So
I think that provides a good segue to encouraging folks to come to Long Island
Come to
to
Long
see
Island.
what we do, what it looks like on the landscape, and what we're doing for suppression, so that you're not recreating the wheel when southern pine beetle arrives. We're doing our best over here, but unfortunately, beetles are moving your way.
We have another question in the chat. Leon asked, on a small privately owned parcel, are there suppression actions short of cutting down trees?
So a small privately owned parcel, that is, there's a lot of them on Long Island. If a lot of people have a couple acres and they love their trees and they have a little pine forest and all their neighbors have 1 acre, it's usually the same community. You have 2 acre parcels, all with 1 acre of forest on them. Talk to your neighbors. When I get phone calls like this, my neighbor has southern pine beetle and it's going to come on my property. I was like, go talk to them. You see if they'll cut them, or if they have the resources to do it now while they're infested, because the whole community is going to have that while they're green. If it's left, there are the chemical options for protecting small numbers of trees. I have never been exposed to anyone who's attempted them. By the time you're seeing pitch tubes, it's too late. I will say that. I would say it's too late for chemicals. If it's one of those stage 1s and you see pitch tubes, it's too late. It's too late for insecticide, because they have those sporangia and they vector the fungal. So as soon as those adults have hit the cambium, it's inoculated with a pathogenic fungus that is as aggressive or more aggressive than the beetle. So even if you put insecticide in there without fungicide, you're not going to have success. So it's pro-action. It's pro-action and it's landscape level. And we all want to be able to protect our trees. But you got to protect the whole forest in this case. Sorry.
I think that's where, if you are a private landowner that has larger land area, to be taking advantage of some of those public funding resources, or private funding resources, so that you can actively manage your land proactively.
Mm-hmm. And even on a small scale, if you do have more than just an acre or two, if you had more like 50 acres, if you were to thin that, but you're surrounded by densely packed pine, the southern pine beetle is going to move through a 50-acre thinning if it's got 1,000 acres of area to develop major populations. So it's about talking to your neighbors. It's about creating community. And I brought that question up with Rob about filling out that ICS flow chart, because literally anyone can do it. It's the 209. I think it's the 209. It's the org chart where you can just plug in people and what they do, and where they are and who to contact. It's got to be the whole community support. And being lucky enough, if you're in an area where you can be proactive, we're playing catch up still.
Alrighty. So I think that's it for us. Thank you all again for participating, and thank you to the speakers for participating. I'm sure you've gotten the impression now that this is, an interagency effort, and there are a lot of players. So I appreciate everyone coming together on this. And just a reminder about the field day on October 27th. I've put a link in the chat for you to register if you haven't already. Just know that it's filling up pretty quickly. I think there's only maybe 6 to 8 spots left. So if you plan on attending, I would register sooner than later. But otherwise, have a great rest of your day and thank you for participating.